Du lytter til Fitness MK. Det er programmet for os, der træner. Fitness MK er blevet inviteret med til årets Sportskongres, som er den fagkongres, der bliver arrangeret i samarbejde mellem det Danske Idrætsmedicinske Selskab og det Danske Selskab for Sportsfyioterapi. Kongressen den går over 3 dage, torsdag, fredag og lørdag, og undervejs så er der forskellige spor, hvor der er præsentation af en masse idrætsmedicinsk videnskabeligt indhold. Meget af det handler selvfølgelig om behandling af sportsskader og sådan noget, der er meget klinisk orienteret, men det er også noget, der sådan er mere almindelig generelt sportsvidenskabelig karakter. Og jeg har kigget på programmet, og jeg har valgt nogle af de talere fra de interessante headlines ud, som jeg har fået lov til at stikke en mikrofon i ansigtet på, mens jeg er her. Så det vil jeg underholde med det næste stykke tid. Jeg har fået lov til at fange Krogsgaard her på Sportskongressen, og han åbnede ballet til en session, der hedder From Research to Clinical Guidelines, Not Just a Question of P below 0.05. Allerførst så vil du måske lige præsentere dig selv for vores lyttere.
Ja, jeg er jo ortopædkirurg, det har været mange år. Jeg har været på Bispebjerg i over 25 år nu, og jeg er professor i idrætskirurgi og kikkertkirurgi. Og grunden til, at jeg har været med til at lave den her session, som vi taler lidt om nu, det er, fordi jeg beskæftigede mig med spørgeskema i mange år, også sideløbende med, og har været så heldig og samarbejdet med nogle af dem, der ved allermest om sådan noget i relation til statistik og hvordan man laver spørgeskema og sådan noget i mange år. Så det interesserer mig rigtig meget.
I oplægget, der langer du jo ud, kan man godt sige, der bliver skudt med skarpt efter det her fænomen, der havde kaldes patient-reported outcomes. Kan du beskrive for os lyttere, hvad det er? Altså, hvad for nogle succeskriterier har man at måle på i forbindelse med rehabilitering ved skader og traumer?
Altså, man kan jo sige, at der kan være forskellige outcomes, når man skal vurdere resultatet af noget. Og et outcome, som har været meget inde i vælten i de sidste 15 år måske, det er patient-reported outcome measures, som er faktisk en talmæssig omsættelse af, hvordan patienterne synes, det går. Og det kan man spørge om på mange måder. Man kan jo faktisk bare spørge patienterne, hvordan synes du, det går på en skala fra 1 til 10. Og det kan man også sagtens. Men de fleste spørgeskemaer, de er jo sådan lidt mere komplekse, fordi man siger, at der er jo mange ting, der betyder noget for patienterne. Og før i tiden, der var det jo lægen, der bestemte, om patienterne blev raske, ikke? Eller måske også fysioterapeuten, det ved jeg ikke, men sådan er det jo ikke rigtig mere. Nu er det sådan set patienten, der tager stilling til, om det er gået godt eller ej. De gamle spørgeskemaer, de blev typisk lavet ved, at nogen, som havde med patienter at gøre, og som mente, at de nok vidste, hvad der betød noget for patienterne, at de lavede sådan nogle spørgsmål, som patienterne så kunne svare på, og så lagde man pointene sammen, og så fandt man ud af, om det var gået op eller ned, og om noget var bedre end noget andet. Den måde, man skal gøre det på, hvis det skal gøres på en rigtig måde, det er for det første, at man skal udvikle spørgsmålene ved hjælp af patienterne. Det er patienterne, der skal udvikle spørgsmålene. Det gør man typisk ved, at de sidder måske i nogle, lidt afhængig af, hvad det er. Hvis det er sådan en intim spørgsmål, så er det nok ikke i grupper. Men altså, hvis typisk for bevægeapparatet, så sidder man måske 4-5 stykker, som har den pågældende lidelse, som man godt vil lave spørgeskema om, og så taler de om, hvad er det egentlig for noget, der betyder noget for mig i relation til den lidelse, jeg har her. Og så når de frem til nogle emner, det kan være smerter, det kan være instabilitet, det kan være, at man er uden for det faglige eller det sportslige miljø. For børn kan det være noget med leg i skolegården og alt sådan nogle ting. Og der er meget af det, som vi ikke umiddelbart vil tænke over. Og så når man så frem man har så nogle flere grupper, hvor man så gradvist finder nogle spørgsmål frem, og så prøver man med efter de andre grupper, om det også er relevant. Altså, vi havde engang en gruppe, hvor der var 2, der red meget på hest, og så var hestespørgsmål. Det var virkelig det allervigtigste. Det faldt så i nogle af de senere gruppe ting. Så det er det første, man skal gøre. Det er, at man skal have patienterne til at lave spørgsmålene. Og det er der kun cirka mellem 10 og 15% af de spørgeskemaer, vi har, som er lavet på den måde. Og det vil sige, at for 85%, der ved man ikke, om det faktisk er noget, patienten synes er vigtigt eller ej. Og det viste jeg et eksempel på i dag, hvor et spørgeskema har været brugt, og hvor man ikke fandt, at det var særlig godt. Der var ikke særlig stor forskel på de forskellige 2 behandlinger. Men hvis man så spurgte patienterne om, var de tilfredse, og hvad synes de havde de løst problemerne og sådan noget, så var der en behandling, som de højsignifikant synes var meget bedre. Og det kom slet ikke frem, og det vil sige, at det spørgeskema, det er dårligt. Det kan ikke bruges til at vurdere, hvordan de patienter egentlig har det. Når man så er færdig og har lavet, typisk så laver man måske rigtig mange spørgsmål, fordi patienter kommer mange ting frem, så skal man finde ud af, hvordan måler de her spørgsmål. Hvordan er der spørgsmål, som vi ikke behøver at stille, fordi alle de andre spørgsmål, vi har, de siger det lige så godt, når vi skal lægge point sammen og sådan noget. Og det er der, hvor man så kan bruge statistik, som i et vist omfang er opfundet i Danmark faktisk tilbage i sidste århundrede, og hvor de 2, som var med mig i dag på symposiet, er nogle af dem, der ved allermest om det i verden, og som jeg har lært rigtig meget af. Og når man så har gjort det, så har man et spørgeskema, som man kan sige, det måler sig lige så godt som hvis, vi vil aldrig finde på, hvis du tager en blodprøve og skal måle D-vitamin, og så sjuster lidt frem til, hvordan måler vi egentlig det. Der skal man jo vide præcist, at det måler korrekt hver gang, og at det metoden er udviklet på en god måde og sådan noget. Så det er derfor, at der burde være krav til, at spørgeskemaer, de er rigtig gode, når man skal bruge dem som afkomst. Det gør ikke så meget, hvis nu du har 100 patienter, og så vil du godt vide, okay, har de fået det bedre? Fordi det kan du godt måle selv med en ret dårlig spørgeskema. Men hvis du skal se en forskel, så er det jo vigtigt, at du måler præcist. Og det er jo det, der har været problemet i relation det her symposium handlede om guidelines, nationale guidelines for, hvordan man skal behandle forskellige lidelser, hvordan man skal udrede dem. Og hvis man bruger som udgangspunkt for sådan nogle guidelines, at nogle undersøgelser, som er lavet med dårlige prompts, så finder man tit, der er ikke nogen forskel mellem 2 behandlinger. Simpelthen fordi den spørgeskema er så dårlig, at det kan ikke måle nogen forskel. Og det er det, der gør, at vi har guidelines, som på mange måder er gode, men i relation til at anbefale behandlinger, så er de altså faktisk rigtig dårlige. De er nærmest amatøragtige, nogle af dem.
Så jeg tillader mig lige at levere sådan et kontekst for lytterne, for alle dem, der ligesom ikke er med. Fordi det her med at udvikle de her paneler, det er jo en ret stor del af litteraturen. Og det er jo det kvalitetsmål, som behandlinger bliver målt op mod. Så det er jo så der var ikke jeg prøver bare på at anskueliggøre, at det er lidt kontroversielle standpunkter her, og der gik man fornemmede lige sådan et par sus, ligesom i publikum til, fordi ligesom, der er nogen, der arbejder med dem her, som måske føler også, at man går dem lidt nært ved at sige, at det er problematisk at bruge mange af de her værktøjer, som mange af dem, der er her på kongressen også bruger.
Det mener jeg sådan set, jeg mener ikke, man kan diskutere det, fordi da vi startede med at kigge lidt på det, så var der nogen, der siger, det betyder ikke så meget. Men så undersøgte vi jo faktisk. Vi gik igennem randomiserede studier for 10 år, tror jeg, inden for bevægeapparatet, og fandt rigtig mange, og så vi, hvad for nogle prompts, de havde brugt, og så vi, hvor mange af dem fandt faktisk forskel imellem behandlingerne. Og dem, der brugte en god prompt, de havde 46%, der fandt forskel. Dem, der brugte en dårlig prompt, de fandt 22%. Så det, hvis du bruger en dårlig prompt, er risikoen for, at du ikke finder en forskel, der faktisk er der, den er over 50%.
Så en PROM, det står for, bare lige så lytterne med, Patient Reported Outcome Measure. Hvordan vurderer man, om det er et godt eller dårligt værktøj i den sammenhæng? Altså, hvordan har I puttet den i den ene eller den anden kasse?
Det gør man ved at gå ind og se, hvordan det er udviklet, og fordi når man laver en prompt, så laver man jo en artikel, som beskriver, hvordan det her er udviklet. Og så kan man gå ind og se, at det er udviklet på den rigtige måde. Dem, der hedder Cosmin, som er udsprunget nede fra Holland, så de har lavet nogle guidelines, som er meget, meget grundige, hvor man kan gå ind og se, hvordan skal en god prompt være udviklet. Så der går man ind og finder den artikel, som er den første, der beskriver, hvordan prompten er udviklet. Og så kan man se, om udviklingen af spørgsmålene faktisk er gode. Så kan det godt være sådan, at man med hensyn til måleegenskaberne, dem kan man jo måle på forskellige måder og i forskellige patientgrupper og sådan noget. Og der kan godt være flere artikler, som har målt det med gode eller dårlige metoder. Så det er at gå alt det der igennem.
Men man kan vel godt, altså selvom den så ikke er udviklet på den rigtige måde, altså en blind høne finder også korn, man kan jo godt forestille sig, at bare fordi det er klinikerne, der har lavet spørgsmålene, at de er nået frem til det samme, eller noget, der er tæt på det, som patienterne ville have sagt. Altså er der nogen mulighed for at undersøge det i virkeligheden?
Ja, altså nu vil jeg sige for det første, at vi har jo faktisk vist, at det er ikke sådan, at det som regel er godt, når det ikke er udviklet ordentligt. Men man kan godt gøre det, at man så laver en sekundær indholdsvalidering af det. Altså, så kan man sige, okay, vi har den her prompt, den er nok ikke udviklet på en rigtig måde, men vi vil godt så høre nogle patienter om, hvad synes de om spørgsmålene. Problemet med det er bare, at når man laver, altså man får jo så ikke nye ting ind. Så skal man i hvert fald lave det, sådan at man siger, okay, nu har vi den her prompt, og så bruger vi de her spørgsmål til ligesom at hjælpe til med, hvad er det, der kan være relevant. Men man skal jo åbne op for, hvis man gør det på den måde, at så siger de, jamen prøv at der er slet ikke nogen spørgsmål om det og det, og heller ikke noget om det og det, og det synes vi faktisk er rigtig relevant. Og så kan du sige, så ender du kan godt gøre det, men så ender du op med en prompt med nogle helt andre spørgsmål. Det kan godt være, at nogle af spørgsmålene er de samme, og de har sagt, at det er super gode spørgsmål, men så ender du tit op med, at så er der en masse andre spørgsmål, som så skal med, og så har du en helt ny prompt.
Så de her forskellige værktøjer, der findes, de er jo typisk specifikke for bestemte kliniske problemstillinger og forskellige patientgrupper. Hvis man, hvor mange af dem, hvor stor en del af dem er det her et gældende problem for, er din vurdering, eller måske har jeg regnet det ud, det ved jeg ikke?
Altså problemet er der for 85% af dem. Så det er kun 10-15% af dem, som faktisk fungerer, som er lavet på den rigtige måde, og hvor man ved, at de har gode måleegenskaber. Så det er jo ikke godt. Og det er jo også derfor, at noget af det, vi taler om i dag, det var et spørgsmål, der kommer, som jeg synes er meget relevant. Jamen, hvad skal vi så gøre? Vi vil godt lave en undersøgelse. Hvad skal vi så bruge? Der er ikke nogen ordentlig prompt til det her. Og så er det, man kan godt bruge en dårlig prompt, men så må man sige, okay, så har du en stor risiko for at der er type 2-fejl, altså at du ikke viser noget, en forskel, der faktisk er der. Og det må du så tage ind i din diskussion, og så sige, prøv at vi har ikke fundet nogen forskel, men der er faktisk over 50% sandsynlighed for, at det er forkert. Men så kan man også gøre det, at man i stedet for at sige, vi har et primært outcome, som er en en promptscore, at så siger man, okay, vi vil godt belyse det her med flere ting. Det kunne være, kommer patienterne tilbage i arbejde, eller kan de gå tilbage i sport? Det kan være aktivitetsniveau, det kan være nogle andre ting. Det kan også være tilfredshedsspørgsmål, som patienterne siger, har de fået løst deres problem? Og så siger de, ja, det har vi, og så er der flere i den ene gruppe, efter den ene behandling, som har fået løst problemet, men efter den anden. Og der synes jeg, at man har fokuseret rigtig meget. Der er rigtig, rigtig mange studier, som fokuserer fuldstændig på, at vi har et primært outcome, og det er en eller anden dårlig prompt, ikke? Og det er altså ikke godt.
Så er løsningen, at der i virkeligheden bliver udviklet helt nye spørgeskemaer til de forskellige problematikker og patientgrupper?
Ja, det er jo den optimale løsning, og så svært er det heller ikke at lave en god prompt. Man skal bare vide, hvordan man gør. Så det tror jeg, der kommer flere og flere af. Og indtil det, så synes jeg, man skal kigge lidt bredere på outcomes. Altså sige, så må vi have nogle outcomes, som ikke lige er en prompt. Det kan godt være, at vi har en prompt, og så måske har en halvdårlig prompt. Og så tager vi nogle ekstra ting med, som også kan belyse tilstand. Det kunne være, hvis det er noget med benene, så kan det være hoptest for eksempel. Hvor meget kan du hoppe, ikke? Vi vil gerne, det her handler om sport. Hvor hurtigt kan du løbe? Sådan nogle ting kan man også godt også få ind i det, som man godt kunne forestille sig var relevant i hvert fald.
Ja, altså, som jeg forstår det, så historikken omkring det med patient reported outcomes er jo også lidt, at det kom efter sådan, altså det er opstået efter en periode, hvor der har været meget fokus på billeddiagnostik. Det er der i hvert fald nogen, der synes. Men det her med den her form for objektive mål, du beskriver, sådan tørre biomarkører, det er ikke noget, jeg synes, man ser så meget. Er det noget, sådan, du tænker, sådan, der ligesom er på vej ind? Altså, der er jo nogle praktiske problematikker omkring at måle noget af det en gang imellem, og der er noget kultur omkring det og sådan noget. Men tænker du, det er noget, der kommer sådan nu?
Altså, det vil jeg da håbe, for det er jo rigtigt, som du... Altså, spørgeskemaer har man haft i rigtig, rigtig mange år, altså i 100 år måske. Okay. Men så er det, at man har sagt, og hvad der også er korrekt i omkring årtusindskiftet måske, eller lige før det, at det er jo faktisk patienterne, som ved, hvordan det går. Det er ikke lægen eller fysioterapeuterne, eller hvem det er, der behandler, som bestemmer, om det her det er gået godt eller ej. Og derfor så har man sagt, at den vigtigste outcome, det er faktisk proms. Men det holder bare ikke rigtigt, hvis man ikke har en ordentlig prom. Fordi så har du et dårligt målredskab, og med stor risiko for at måle forkert. Og så hvis du siger, at det er det eneste, vi faktisk er interesseret i at måle, at så ender du i... Så vil du tit ikke finde en forskel, og du vil også tit faktisk konkludere forkert.
Inden for den psykologiske forskning, der taler man jo om det her reproducibility crisis. Tænker du, at man nærmer sig sådan en problemstilling, der minder om det inden for sådan en klinikken med det her?
Ja, nu kender jeg ikke lige den der diskussion, faktisk.
Men det grundlæggende er det enormt mange af de studier inden for sådan den psykologiske forskning, som man tænker har været bærende for forskellige hypoteser omkring, hvordan mennesker virker, har det vist sig ikke kan reproduceres. Ja. Altså, og det er jo noget, der ligesom har trukket gulvtæppet lidt væk under store dele af den psykologiske forskning. Ja. Tænker du, at lidt det samme ender med at kunne ske med den kliniske forskning omkring muskel-skeletapparatet her?
Ja, altså jeg tror, at det bliver mere nuanceret, fordi hvis du ser på for eksempel studier om menisk eller problemer eller studier om slidgigt, så er de lavet meget på den samme måde. De bruger alle sammen, selvom alle har vidst siden de sidste 15 år, at hvilke proms der er dårlige, for eksempel til at måle menisk, hvordan meniskpatienter har det, eller patienter med forreste korsbånd, og hvad for nogen, der måske er lidt bedre, så bliver de stadigvæk brugt, de dårlige proms, i helt nye studier, og på en måde, som giver dårlige måleegenskaber. Altså for eksempel man kan ikke lægge en proms har jo tit nogle domæner, noget handler om smerter, noget handler om funktion og sådan noget. Man kan ikke lægge de der point sammen. Det er jo sådan noget, man tit gør, fordi det er sådan lidt nemmere, så får man kun et tal. Og det er også igen med til at udtvære det hele til en stor... Og det, der jeg synes er meget kedeligt, det er, at der stadigvæk kommer studier, som bruger rigtig, rigtig dårlige proms. Der er... kan man sige nok visse grupper af forskere, som ikke synes, det er vigtigt, og som faktisk ikke gider deltage i den debat om man skulle have en ordentlig prom, og som bare forsker videre og konkluderer. Og det tror jeg ikke holder i længden. Jeg tror ikke, det holder. Så jeg tror, der bliver en ændring, hvor man siger, vi skal nok faktisk have nogle flere ting med, fordi det er ikke nok bare at se det med en prompt, som måske ikke er specielt god.
Så den her Cosmin-gruppe, de har jo lavet den her checklist, yes, som ligesom viser, hvordan sådan en algoritme, hvor man laver en prompt godt fra start af. Findes der nogen oversigtsartikel, hvor det er gennemgået, hvad for nogle af de her prompts, der ligesom opfylder de her Cosmin-kriterier, eller ej?
Altså, Cosmin har jo et vist katalog over det. Vi lavede faktisk det blev publiceret for 1,5 år siden, et katalog med 67 prompts inden for bevægeapparatet, hvor man kan finde de fleste af dem. Det er ikke lavet helt efter Cosmins principper, men vi har tjekket efter, om der er nogle af dem, vi har taget ud og undersøgt med kosmiske principper, som først, de nye kosmiske principper kom først efter det arbejde, vi lavede. Men vi har tjekket dem efter, og de giver det samme. Vi har brugt, det er nogenlunde de samme kriterier, vi har brugt. Så vi har lavet sådan en katalog, og det er faktisk det eneste, der rigtig findes. Og så findes der det, som Cosmin, de har sådan en vis bank af, når folk har lavet nogle, men de har ikke systematiseret det. Så det er mange forskellige prompts.
Så de vedligeholder ikke selv et oversigt, de der Cosmin, over ligesom over prompts?
Ikke, de laver ikke selv, men der er mange mennesker, der laver det, og så bruger det, og så kan Cosmin få lov at linke op til det, ikke?
Og det vil bare være praktisk, hvis man bruger den videnskabelige litteratur, og kigger på den intervention, og de har brugt det eller det værktøj, så vil det være rart, at der var et sted, man kunne finde ud af, om det er en af dem, hvor man lige skal være lidt forsigtig eller ej. Ja.
Men altså, der vil jeg anbefale den, som det er Christian Fugl Hansen, som er første forfatter. Vi har lavet det på, og det er en artikel, der fylder 300 sider. Og der er tabeller, hvor du kan se, hvordan er de udviklet, de her prompts, og alle validiterer de der studier, som har målt måleegenskaberne, de er også valideret efter meget strikte metoder, som Carl Bang Christensen, som vi hørte i dag, at han har jo været med i det arbejde også, så det er foregået på fuldstændig højt og meget sobert niveau.
Findes det eventuelt online i en tabel også, eller ligger det kun i en pdf-fil i en artikel?
Det findes. Det er publiceret i Scandinavian Journal of Medicine and Science and Medicine and Sports, det grønne blad, og det er open access, så det kan man bare gå ind.
Men det ligger ikke i en separat tabel på en hjemmeside på den måde, altså hvor det er søgbart igennem Google?
Ja, du kan nok søge på selve artiklen, indår det er. Nej, det ligger ikke på det ligger på under tidsskriftet, hvor det er publiceret. Men det er open access, så du kan sagtens gå ind og finde det. Så skal du bare lige gå ind i supplementary, for der er de der 300 sider.
Fedt. Jamen, jeg tror faktisk ikke, at jeg har flere spørgsmål. Jeg vil sige mange tak for, at vi måtte låne dig i 20 minutter. Må vi få dit fulde navn, og hvis du eventuelt vil have nogle folk, der skal følge med i jeres arbejde, så hvorhen man gør det?
Ja, altså jeg hedder Michael Rindom Krogsgaard, og vi har jo ikke nogen hjemmeside eller noget, men altså man kan jo søge på, vi laver jo tit noget, Christian Fugl Hansen laver mange ting, og man kan kombinere hans navn og mit navn, så kommer der i hvert fald nogle af de ting frem, vi laver. Men det kan da være, at vi skal lave en hjemmeside.
Fedt, tak for det.
Det er godt. Tak for interessen.
Jamen, så er det fredag, og vi sidder her på Sportskongres med Karin McCreesh, som er fra Irland, og derfor så kommer resten af det her selvfølgelig til at foregå på engelsk. So, Karin, would you just like briefly to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Karin McCreesh. I'm an associate professor in the university right on the southwest coast of Ireland, right on the Atlantic, next to America. So we're a small university where we've been running a physiotherapy program there now for 20 years. And so my main job is to teach on the physiotherapy program. But I also, when I can, do some research, and my really passionate areas are shoulder pain, any kind of chronic pain, and broadly thinking about how we need to manage musculoskeletal disorders in physiotherapy care.
Yeah. So, and thank you for taking time to talk with us and the listeners this morning. So you gave a talk that was named "The Resistance Training in Shoulder Rehabilitation's Potentials and Shortcomings," and and that's a topic that interests me personally a lot, and probably a lot of listeners, because shoulder rehabilitation for people that do a lot of recreational sports is, at least when you cross 30, most people have got something in the shoulder that borders on the clinical of something, borders on something that's clinical, but at least have some kind of pain. And this whole notion of using resistance training in treating tendon or tendon muscle aponeurosis stuff has been something that's been coming on for a lot of years. So I'm really interested in hearing where we are with that now.
Yeah, I think you're right that we've come a really, really long way. And that was where I started the talk yesterday, is saying how far we've come in terms of just thinking about the shoulder. Because when I graduated from physiotherapy some more than 20 years ago. We treated shoulder tendonitis, as we called it, as an inflammatory condition. We frictioned the shoulder until, your own fingers went numb, and then we put some nice therapeutic ultrasound on there. We did some pendular exercises, and off you go. It's a sea change now. We've got these complex programs where people are doing a lot of loading. They're doing it for 12 weeks. They are also getting a lot of education, and we're delivering those programs in, really interesting and adaptable ways that kind of meet our patients' needs. So we've come a really, really long way in thinking about how we use rehabilitation for shoulder pain. We probably haven't come as far though as the lower limb kind of tendon story has come, Maybe that's because the shoulder is somewhat different, and every time I go to a tendon research conference, people kind of look at me pityingly and say, oh, you do the shoulder tendons. What did you do bad in life? Because there's this idea that, managing lower limb tendons is very linear, and, we do this, and this is, gets better. But when we try and do the same stuff to the shoulder, it's very mixed.
Yeah.
And that may be because we see different pain mechanisms driving the type of shoulder pain that we see. It's certainly the case that we struggle to diagnose what is going on in people who present with shoulder pain. So our clinical tests are not really very good at telling us what's going on. Imaging's not very good at telling us what's going on. So we struggle to get a clear diagnosis very often. And that perhaps limits how certain we can be about rehab. But in saying all of that, I think if we can, broadly categorize people as having rotator cuff related shoulder pain or any of those labels, then it's very clear that exercise with a strengthening component does seem to be successful. In saying that, then we want to say as physios, right, what's the dose, what's the frequency, what are the fit principles, we need to deliver here. And that's where we struggle. So yesterday I would have talked about a whole host of systematic reviews that have tried to say, what are the fit principles? How often, how much, how intense should we exercise these people? And while there does seem to be some trends towards doing higher intensity exercises better, some trends towards, at least making sure that the exercise progresses over a 12-week period, we haven't got any really strong data to base that on. So every time you do a review, it's wholly disappointing, because you get to the end and you say, well, I have to say the conclusions I'm going to make are very uncertain because the quality of the research here is poor. The reporting of the actual exercise itself in the trials is often really, really poor. So these trials don't give us reproducible programs even. But again, it's improving. Michael Clausen presented his sexy trial yesterday as part of that
sexy
symposium.
Trial.
The sexy trial, yeah.
Nice.
The sexy. Oh yeah, absolutely.
He won the acronym game.
The best trial acronym ever. Full stop. Not going to be beaten, and has done wonders for the excitement of shoulder rehab. So yeah, we're going to give big kudos to Michael for that one. And of course, that's the most important thing about a trial. When you sit down to apply for a grant for a trial, you don't plan the proposal at all. The first thing is the acronym. Here we go. Acronym city. So I'm actually also working in a meniscal tear study at the moment, and our acronym is knee deep, which we love, of course. So yeah. Michael does have the best acronym, but he also has a wonderful trial where, he presented some of the secondary follow-up from it yesterday. I suppose the key thing where he was focusing on was the best exercise is the one the patient will do. So adherence was a huge issue for him. First of all, the trial was really well set up prospectively to look at adherence. So he had this device which clipped to the patient's TheraBand. It's called a band sizer, designed here in Denmark, and so you could see objectively what the patients were really doing at home, and there's a limit to how much patients will do. Again, athletes maybe are a different group, but your standard patient, there's only so much exercise they're going to be prepared to do at home. So the best one is the one they're going to do. I think that's really important. Yes, it does need to be probably progressive. Yes, it needs to be a reasonably high level of intensity, but beyond that, let's think about more how we deliver it, and also the kind of education and support that we put around the rehabilitation program. And those things are going to be just as important as exactly which exercise it is that we are delivering.
Yeah. So, I appreciate, and the listeners should as well, that like the shoulder is an amazingly complex joint, and it's very, very hard to discern what pain is specific to certain structures and what pain is unspecific, and especially with this whole advert of like the coming of like the whole neuroscience, biopsychosocial. It's extremely hard to know what is what when it hurts in the shoulder. But with the lower body rehabilitation in the heavy slow resistance training prescriptions that has come on, you try to force people into positions where they have to load in a way that people would intuitively try to avoid. So you put people on wedges to push their knees forward when they're rehabilitating for patellar tendinopathy. Is the same kind of thinking applicable in shoulder pain? So if you have anterior shoulder pain, would it be specifically advisable to do like extra wide grip bench presses or behind the neck presses, or some of those movements that would normally be considered no-go, or at least something you should be careful doing? Yeah,
how much pain are we happy? And again, these were discussions we had yesterday. In fact, we had a second session purely on pain in the shoulder.
I was hoping you're saying it's purely for bench press.
Okay. Well, no, I won't be that specific. So we had a whole session on, where is the pain coming from with these patients with shoulder pain. And you're right, the shoulder is a rich source of mechanoreceptors and nociceptors in lots of different areas. So it certainly has lots of reasons for potentially being a source of nociception. And then when we add all of the other reasons why that might become pain, then it's about being a person rather than being somebody who happens to have a shoulder.
Yeah.
But there were certainly enough trials to say that it's not just okay, but maybe advisable to get people to work into pain. I mean, Chris Littlewood ran a trial where essentially, he used a single 1 or 2 exercises within his trial where patients were asked to work into the place where they had pain. So, there certainly doesn't seem to be any concern, and there would have been, oh, no, we don't get people to push into their pain. So, certainly in the rotator cuff tendon population, it's considered perfectly acceptable and advisable to get your patient to work into those areas where there is pain, and then thinking about the rotator cuff as in its roles. It's a stabilizer and it's a mobilizer. So to try and do exercises that obviously can bring it through both of those roles, where it's stabilizing the humeral head, but where it's also then working as a prime mover in rotation. Beyond that, whether there's any specific magic exercise, no, I don't think so. But I do agree with you that thinking about where somebody has their pain actually is where we need to be working. That's the impairment.
Training into pain.
That's the impairment, yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe there was a time we were more fearful of that. Caveat. So again, in Mikkel's study yesterday, so he looked at pain catastrophizing, and he looked at the patients who didn't adhere to the exercise prescription, and they were the ones with a higher level of pain catastrophizing. So if people are very fearful of pain, they're likely not to do what you ask. And I think that's where we're beginning to really be more aware about the biopsychosocial influences on exercise prescription. So if they're fearful of pain, you might well give them that movement into pain as the key impairment that they need to work on, but they won't do it if they've got a huge amount of fear. So there's a sense that we need to maybe start stratifying, dare I say, or identifying people who have those higher levels of pain-related fear, poorer movement confidence. And those are the ones maybe that I'm not saying you can't push them into pain, but you're going to have to guide them more. You're going to have to grade them more towards working into pain. So this is where we talk about our graded imagery or graded work towards exposing somebody to moving into the painful part of the movement. Yeah. They may need to do that under more supervision. They may need a bit more confidence and support in that. So, yes, work people into pain, but with a caveat that if they've got high levels of pain-related fear, they're likely to just go the opposite way for you, and that you might need to support them a lot more in that.
Yeah. So while it's been appreciated for some time that graded exposure is needed in physiological terms, it is also needed in pain exposure.
I think you're, and again, it's nice. It was really nice to see that Mikkel's secondary analysis had that within the trial, where we instinctively clinicians know, I can push that patient, I probably can't push that patient, or I did push that one and, I probably regret it. Or too soon. So to see that within a trial where actually he could identify the people with the high catastrophizing and see that they had then decided and made their own decision. I'm not doing it. It's going to hurt me. forget it. I have a PhD student at the moment, Catherine Fahey, a wonderful sports physiotherapist who's working with people with large to massive tears. She's doing a qualitative study at the moment.
Rotator cuff tears.
Oh, large to massive rotator cuff tears, yeah absolutely. Talking to patients and healthcare providers about massive tears and how do we try and understand whether rehab is a good idea for those. And, there's a combination of things in terms of what the patients are saying, but some of them are saying, you need to get your head read if you think I'm going to do painful exercise. And get your head read in Ireland would mean, forget it, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to make myself hurt, just to please my physiotherapist. And on the other hand, there are patients who are saying in that same study, you know what, the doctor just keeps throwing pills at me and all I want to do is function. And that's a patient who's saying, I want to do function, I want to do movement. Whereas the other patient who's saying, I'm not doing that painful exercise, are the ones who, need more support on the pain management side. So research is not going to be the place that will probably answer who exactly you can push and who you can't push, but it can give you some indications. So pain-related fear certainly is one reason why you might not push somebody as soon or as quickly as others.
I can't help but think of something slightly provocative. Here, there's a lot of people from Middle Eastern countries here in Copenhagen, and they have got, at least for some parts of the Middle East, they report pain differently and mostly higher pain for the same. They generally report higher pain for painful conditions. So that could probably play into some kind of ethno-cultural differentiation of treatment in those scenarios as well.
Look, we have to be biopsychosocially aware, and the social is the cultural bit, isn't it? And, whether we listen to the label of, it's 8 out of 10 versus 3 out of 10, or think about the acceptable symptom state. So how acceptable is it for you to work at this level of pain? Is that something that you're prepared to accept?
I think that's also shown ethno-cultural differences for that specifically.
In that one as well, yeah. So, but again, I think that's the only thing we can do is say what's acceptable to you as a person to rehabilitate you. This is where we want to go. We want you to actually work with some experience of pain, because that then teaches your body that it's safe to do that. Yeah. And we have to work in the area where you're weakest to try and improve things. But there are lots of different ways to approach this kind of rehab is what I would be saying. Like if you're working with athletes who are highly motivated and highly movement confident, there's a whole direction you can take that, is traditional in terms of resistance training. If you're working with, middle-aged and older adults who have low levels of movement confidence, low levels of, physical activity history, then you do need to look at it in different ways. And look, I'm a huge proponent of group exercise because I think it levels a bit of that playing field slightly for, when people are exercising with others. There's a little bit of comparison between us. There's probably a little bit of competition. So we have qualitative work from a group exercise study in shoulder pain that people say, well, I really mastered the exercises. So by doing those 2 sessions a week for 6 weeks, I felt really competent in the exercises by the end of that. And the fact that people emphasise that in the qualitative, I suppose, told us that they didn't feel mastery of the exercises before that. These were people often who had individual physio, but just that repeated coming back to the class under guidance gave them the mastery so that they felt a lot more confident to then perform the exercises at home. When we looked at an individual versus a group exercise program, the people who'd done the group exercise program were more likely to be exercising a couple of months later because they had the mastery of the exercises. So I think, group can give you things that may help culturally.
What group size is this?
So these were 6 to 8 patients with one physiotherapist.
So with the possibility of actual individual correcting.
And I guess for us, the key thing in that study, and this was work done by a PhD student called Dr. Eva Barrett, was that it was quite an experienced physio running the groups. Not, somebody who was very new into physiotherapy. So it was a therapist who had that confidence to sit back and say, look, I can look at 6 people exercising at once and I can titrate what you need and what you need. Over that period of time, I can get to know these patients very well. So I think there's a real skill in running a group well. And physios can harness that for certain patient groups. Probably, maybe not their athletic groups. But in these older patients, middle-aged patients, working in a group, they feel a bit of responsibility to each other. So they'd say, I would do my exercises at home, like do my homework, because I felt guilty coming in the next day to my other kind of classmates that I hadn't done my exercises. Caveat, as always, people with lower health literacy, lower socioeconomic groups probably don't engage with groups as much as people with, who are more educated, for example. So as always, you're choosing who the right people are. But there's different ways to deliver these programs. It's not all a one-on-one, talking directly to the physio. And different populations are going to need those different approaches. And also, we don't have enough resources to deliver it one-on-one to all the people who need it.
No.
We sure don't.
What exercises were the doing in those in that group setting?
So this was an exercise protocol that we had developed together in a community of practice in the Irish Shoulder and Elbow Physios group. So this was a bunch of physios who worked with me for a year or more saying, we have a problem. We can't deliver this care to the people who need it. Let's start doing groups. And so we came up with a consensus group of exercises. But really the key thing was it wasn't really about the exercises, because in Eva's work, she compared groups which did a very kind of thoracic postural focused set of exercises compared to a much more rotator cuff strengthening focused group of exercises. And there was no difference in outcome. The patients came and they exercised. And that was the key thing, Now, they all involved shoulder loading. They did. But, the key thing wasn't really probably exactly what they did. It was the fact that they were exercising for that period of time and that they had the education and support of a clever, experienced physiotherapist who was reassuring them and supporting them to get on with life.
Does that irk you a little bit?
No, not at all. That really comforts me, because it meant then when we went to roll, so we rolled those groups out, around the country in Ireland. Lots of primary care physios took them on and said, well, I don't have that piece of equipment that you had for the class, or I have a really small room, all my patients have to exercise in unison, we can't do it like a circuit. So then I had we had the flexibility of saying, you know what, it's just do what's good for you, do what fits the equipment that you have, fits the space that you have, and it's probably likely that you're going to get similar results to those that we had. So there was some loading, and it was progressive. So each exercise had, a stage 1 and a stage 2, so that within the group the patients could work a little harder, and the patient who was coming in, this week could see the other patients working at a higher level and aim for that. So those things were important, probably.
Okay, so it doesn't have to be like an external rotation in various settings. It can be presses and pulls and
that's exactly the kind of stuff. So it was a mix of open and closed chain, and there was in each of the sessions that we kind of encouraged them to have at least sort of 2 whole body exercises. So like a squat or a step up, where they were working on a more whole body focus. Yeah.
So do you think that the effects of shoulder exercise are fully unspecific, or do you think there are any components to
I think
shoulder?
they're population dependent, in terms of how specific they might be. Absolutely no question that if you train the cuff, you can make it stronger. There's no doubt about that. And for some populations, making them stronger solves their problem. Yeah. But for lots of our populations, they don't, we train them and they don't actually get stronger. I get
all warm and fuzzy for that.
Yeah, but some populations, you train them and they don't get an awful lot stronger. Like you look at all the trials of strengthening in shoulder pain, and very often they're not that much stronger at the end, objectively. Yeah. But they're better functionally. They're better in terms of their pain. They're sleeping, so... depends what your focused outcome is as to whether you think focused strengthening is important or successful. There's we are underloading our shoulders as a population. Look, I don't work in sport. That's the key thing here as well. So sport isn't my big focus. It's the occupational athlete. It's the weekend warrior. It's the the hairdresser and the farmer. I'm kind of more interested in. I'll be honest. So if I worked with swimmers, I'd have a very different conversation probably with you. So for that more general population, the population where, we've got the probably forthcoming epidemic of shoulder arthroplasties in the future, they're underloading their shoulders chronically. Life doesn't have our arms up here for the people who are not in the gym, for the guys that are not like you. So we are chronically underloading our cuffs probably. So when patients get to you, they're chronically underloaded, and so anything above what they're doing at the moment is good, and so also that you usually have to start at quite a low base.
So you think like they have rotator cuff disc degeneration and pain from underuse, or a once-off overuse on a background of chronic underuse. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
So one thing you haven't talked about, which kind of so a word that very often comes up when talking about is dyskinesia. So I'm really into resistance training and powerlifting and weightlifting and strongman sports and all. And
you're offering all your conflicts of interest here.
But what I'm trying to say, if you're like just doing resistance training in a gym, you may never be like schooled in the ergonomics of lifting stuff. While if you're doing strength sports, the ergonomics, I'm calling it ergonomics, it's not really whatever.
Movement efficiency,
movement efficiency and scapular setting is a huge part of powerlifting and to some extent strongman sports and weightlifting as well.
Yeah.
And at least historically, it's been a really big deal in physiotherapy. So, and I know there's a hen and the egg relationship between pain and dyskinesia, and that treating dyskinesia may influence pain, and pain influences dyskinesia, and
yeah, like the body changes when we're sore. There's no question about that. Yeah. And sometimes that's an adaptive change, and sometimes it's a maladaptive change. And we really comfortable with that when we talk about back pain, about adaptive and maladaptive change. And things that are, secondary changes in relation to pain. And there's no question that a painful shoulder will change. We'll see altered scapulohumeral rhythm. And again, I'm not specifically talking about athletes here. But there was always,
universal, right?
Yeah, there was always a really a big push. I see reverse scapulohumeral rhythm. I've got to do a lot of scapular work. And I suppose my perspective on that certainly is, when we see reverse scapulohumeral rhythm, that's a very clever system. That's a system saying, right now, glenohumeral joint is not functional to do your ADLs. So I'm going to give you that movement from your scapula instead. Okay? Yeah. So the body's a smart thing, and we will adapt to retain function. There's no question that at a point in time that becomes maladaptive. So when we get the patients where that's no longer serving their movement needs anymore, or it's driving their pain, then we need to potentially break that up and give that person back their more efficient movement function. But can we, label the scapula as the evil of all shoulder pain? Certainly not. Certainly not. Look, I have 50 odd new physio students come in September every year, and amuse myself by looking at their scapulas. And will I tell you the proportion of them that have dyskinesis? These are 20-year-old students, a very, very high proportion. I do get to keep them for around 4 years, and I don't hear a lot of shoulder pain reports from them. So, we can talk about what is normal and what's not normal. And certainly there's a high prevalence of wonderful, unusual looking scapular patterning in the general population. The studies that have been done looking at athletic groups are certainly inconsistent in terms of whether they believe that is associated with pain. I reported studies yesterday that talked about the prevalence of imaging-related differences in athletes, so tendon differences, labral tears, so 50% of overhead athletes have something on a scan that looks different to the normal population. Yeah. So whether that's a normal adaptation to the weird and wonderful things that athletes do, or whether it's pathological, we're not really clear. But it's certainly not consistently associated with them having pain.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But yeah. So
that doesn't take away that movement efficiency when you're doing really high load activities makes sense.
But actually, what I was getting at is like the culture of in strength sports of having an awareness of what is going on with the scapula and the shoulder when you're moving.
And
it's probably beneficial
what do you think?
In itself.
It's a healthy culture as you view it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, at least having an awareness of what's going on, because people that do bodybuilding, fitness, some of those don't really have a lot of awareness because the whole culture and way of thinking about the way you're doing exercise is not focused on that.
It's about the end result rather than
it's about
the pathway
creating
of getting
fatigue
there.
and rather than creating stability, and that's just different worlds. I mean, it may look the same for people that are not really into resistance training, but it's different worlds, really.
Yeah, and look, it's a different world probably, certainly from where I'm researching or seeing patients. But certainly when you're doing very, very high load activity and working at the barriers of your function, then it certainly does seem to make sense to be as movement efficient as you can be. Yeah, give the system every chance. But we need to do the same in some ways in our elderly patients or older, middle-aged or older patients is give them every chance to function as best they can, both physically but most importantly probably lifestyle-wise and psychosocially. If your patient's coming to you and they're not sleeping, you're not really going to get anywhere with a resistance training program. So addressing their lack of sleep, will be core to that. And for some patients, that means it might mean needing to, treat their pain with an injection, which, is not something that we're super keen on. But if a patient's only getting 3 or 4 hours sleep a night, that's important. If it's modifying their activity, dropping their activity way back for a while so that they're not driving their night pain by a boom bust cycle during the day. So that, we have to create the environment where people can function at the best of their ability. And in your sport, that's having, the best ergonomics as you describe it. And for the people I'm describing, that's, having the best kind of metabolic and systemic state that you can to have a healthy shoulder. And on top of that, then if we can get you to restore loading and maybe even increase your loading long term to improve your overall health, that's kind of where I'm sitting.
Yeah, I think I don't have any more questions. Can I just have you, if you want people to follow your work, where can they follow you on Twitter?
You can. There are not many Karin McCreeshes around, so it's easy to find me on Twitter. Look, I'm mostly a researcher and a teacher. You'll usually find me at shoulder conferences, but I don't have anything particular to sell you. But I can recommend Jeremy Lewis's amazing book on the shoulder, which was published last year. I do have 1 chapter in it, but look, it's just kind of the Bible, isn't it? Really, if people haven't seen it. Oh God, I should remember what it's called, The Shoulder Theory and Practice. So Jeremy's new book on the shoulder. It's got contributions from everybody who really understands and is passionate about shoulder physiotherapy. So for those who really do kind of want to say, well, what is contemporary thinking on the shoulder? Then Jeremy Lewis's book from last year is well worth an investment, and it's really heavy. And if you lift it up and down a lot, you'll really improve your shoulder strength as well, I'm sure.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm sitting here with Neil Cronin at the Sportskongres, and he was involved with a session called Redesigning Athletes Management in a Digital World, Embracing Emerging Technologies in Sport. So I'm technology interested, and that really caught my eye. Mm-hmm. So I'm really interested in see where we're going with this. But first of all, could you just introduce yourself to the listeners of the podcast?
Of course. So first of all, thank you for having me. So I'm Neil Cronin, and I'm a professor of exercise biology in Jyväskylä in Finland. And in my kind of past life, I worked with muscle tendon mechanics mainly, looked at how muscle and tendon interact, especially during walking, did a lot of imaging, ultrasound, different imaging modalities. And then more recently, I went and studied for a master's degree in AI because I wanted to get really hands-on.
Where's that?
That was also in Jyväskylä.
Okay.
So it was kind of alongside my job. I, in theory, was a part-time associate professor and a part-time student, and in practice, I was full-time at both. So it was a busy few years.
Have your wife?
yeah, with a young son at home as well, which was a stressful time.
Excellent.
But it was very hands-on, which is what I wanted. So I was actually playing with algorithms, working with new AI methods.
So what was your initial education background?
So my PhD, actually, which was done in Aalborg in Denmark, was in kind of neuromechanics, so muscle tendon interaction, but also a little bit about how the brain is involved in that. And
but are you a physiologist by trade?
Biomechanist, really, by trade,
yeah.
Yep. But nowadays I've pivoted more towards AI, so I'm less in a specific field, and I'm more focused on methods and how the AI tools can be applied to different fields.
Yeah. So getting to the session you're involved with, I mean, these days are very exciting days as far as AI usage, commercial or practical everyday use of AI technology goes. So what's going on with athletes?
With athletes, so I should, as I started the session this morning, with a disclaimer, I don't actually work directly with athletes myself, so what I did was present the tools and say these are the ways I think you could roll these things out in sport as well. But one thing we do look at is remote rehabilitation. So we've developed a phone-based app that we can give to people to take home, and they can do certain clinical exercises and things wherever they happen to be in their own home. And from that, we can give them real-time feedback on their performance. So we can follow the same people over.
So you have an algorithm that provides the feedback, or is it? So
you're just using the camera in the phone. There's no kind of high tech involved in this. and then we've added our own algorithms on top of that. And so we're not working with athletes as such, but you could actually take what we've done and transfer it quite easily to monitoring athletes over the course of their season, for example. So what I was trying to do really with this session was just kind of raise awareness of the tools are out there, the technology exists, and these are the different ways you could apply them.
Yeah. So where are the domains of interest as far as application in sports?
Yeah, so a couple of things we discussed this morning. One was very simply using chatbots to get at things like their psychological state of mind, the athletes. How do they feel? Do they feel like they're in condition to train and to perform?
Subjective measures of readiness.
And as a kind of support tool, just as a psychological boost to have someone or something to talk to and to.
That sounds so weird when you're saying
it is weird, and yet so the other guy in the session, Ben Waller, actually presented some data on this and found that basically the athletes accepted this. If you like, therapy robot. So even though they knew they were talking to an algorithm, essentially, they didn't mind.
I'm just waiting for Harrison Ford to shoot a replicant now.
They got some kind of comfort from being able to just talk about their issues.
Yeah.
So that's one facet. But then what I talked about actually was completely different, which is computer vision. So using, for example, the camera in a mobile phone to analyze movement in different ways and to give them useful real-time feedback or near real-time on standardized tests. It could be jumping tests that we perform at regular intervals, some other kind of performance-related movements that can help them to kind of see where they are over the course of the season.
Yeah. So you have some kind of bot that recognizes the movement and provides feedback on what it interprets.
Yeah, so what we're mainly doing is using mostly open source algorithms to detect people in images. So one great thing about the AI movement is a lot of the tools are open source. So you can grab it, you can modify it, and then you can use it in some other application. So we're using things like pose estimation, where you detect the different kind of anatomical body parts of a person in an image. From that, we can compute things like joint angles, we can compute where the limbs are in space, ranges of motion, these kind of things that we might be interested in the clinic, but also perhaps in sport.
Yeah. So is that kind of detection very sensitive? I mean, obviously the angle of detection compared to the person matters, but is that something you can algorithm your way out of?
Well, yeah, there's a few solutions to that. So one is you could do it in 3 dimensions. So I did actually show some data also from 3D.
With 2 cameras?
2 cameras, yeah. Or more, of course, if you can synchronize them. So that's one possibility. Another is you try and pick movements that are so-called planar movements. Of course, in reality, humans don't move in 2 dimensions, but it can give you some approximation, perhaps, of range of motion, for example, if you're measuring from the right angle. So that's one kind of methodological challenge there. Another one actually is that these open source algorithms typically are not trained for these kind of purposes. So for example, they're used a lot in driverless vehicles, where it's not so important that you detect exactly where the different body parts are. It's crucial that you detect, is there a person or not?
Is there a body?
Is there a pedestrian, and does the car need to stop? So the accuracy of the tracking is not so.
So you've actually been using algorithms for driverless vehicles?
Essentially, yeah.
Huh.
And so then, again, for some applications that's surprisingly accurate enough, but then there are other questions where the accuracy is just, it's not good enough that we could make kind of clinical decisions based on what that algorithm's telling us. So, and one kind of alternative there is then you can train your own model. So instead of using some kind of pre-trained tool, you can collect your own data set, label it, train an AI model to work with your specific problem. So it's obviously more work involved in that, but you can then customize it to your own particular setting.
So what comes to my mind now is that sports coaching in sports activities that would be considered closed skill, high jumping, something like that, where you aim to have a very specific movement, specific angles. Yep. So that is kind of like providing feedback on that. I think is something that people would have thunk required human interaction for ever and ever. Yeah. But the way you're describing it, that actually seems like something that can be AI modified.
Yeah, well,
to some extent at least.
Yeah, one kind of use case I could describe. We're working with the Finnish javelin throwers.
Yeah,
because obviously javelin's a big deal in Finland. So we actually go to their training center, which is indoors, and they've given us permission to attach our cameras there permanently. So we can choose where we want them, we can mount them on the wall, and then we can just leave them there. So we can actually customize our entire setup and train our models based on that particular building. And it means that, and we can even customize models for specific throwers. So we can just collect training data from one particular thrower.
Yep.
And create a model that detects release parameters, for example, from that particular individual and how they progress or how they change over the season. So we can actually get to quite a high level of resolution. And of course, it's under our control. We can choose which variables we want, which parameters do the coaches particularly need, what do the athletes want to hear about when immediately they've done a throw. So
are you so far yet that the models can be predictive in the same way that coaches can be?
That's a very good question. To do real, accurate predictive modeling, you first need a huge data set that tells you basically in this situation, this kind of thing tends to happen, whereas in that situation, you tend to get that kind of outcome. To do that, you really need a lot of data. So unless, if we talk about the individual athlete example again, unless that athlete's been injured many, many times, you wouldn't be able to build a clearly customized model that is predictive for that person.
Predictive for injuries?
Yeah.
No, but also predictive of if you do X modification to your technique, it will have Y output. Also that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, in theory, it's possible. We talk a lot about predictive modeling in AI, but you need to have modeled all of those possible scenarios in the first place. So you do need in the background big data sets, which of course in sport is not that easy because by definition, if you're working with elite athletes, there aren't many of them, so it's hard to collect these huge data. In theory, it's possible. In practice, it may take many, many years for you to build the data set to train the model that is.
How confident would you be that that is something we're going to see in, say, 10 years?
That's a very difficult question to
answer. Are we on the 10%, 50%, or 90%?
I would be at the lower end of that spectrum. I mean, 10 years in this field is a long time. There are some areas where in 10 years nothing happens. In this field, 10 years ago, it was a completely different playing field. But I'd be happy to be proven wrong, but I just think to genuinely do this with high accuracy, your model needs to have seen all these different scenarios because it can't learn something that doesn't exist in the training data set. It has to have been shown these kind of scenarios to predict them in the future.
But then again, you're so doesn't that mean that you assume that a certain phenotype or pattern should be visible to us? Maybe it's visible for the model for something, but invisible to us.
Yeah, that's a different issue. I know what you mean. Yeah, so it's not about what the human can see necessarily.
Yeah.
Because, well, as an example, if you look at 1 million medical scans of whatever it happens to be, you can't possibly process and remember all of the little subtle patterns in those images, but a computer can because it has this massive storage capacity and, if you like, a very good memory. So I'm not saying that we need to be able to detect it as humans necessarily, but let's say you want to predict, I don't know, performance level in some sport, you need to have seen that this player had this kind of preparation first, which led to this kind of performance. And then in a different situation, you had a different kind of preparation, which led to a different kind of performance. You need to expose your model to all of that variability for it to learn the patterns in the data. So I don't say it's impossible. I just think you have to be very careful how you would build that data set.
Obviously. Yeah. So, yeah. But what I'm getting at is like individualization of training prescription is a big part of optimization of training. And I like identifying phenotypes and or movement profiles, whatever it is, explosivity profiles. So my really big wet dream, really resistance training protocols. There's a lot of data out there for various apps and stuff like that. And even with a lot of information about the people that are doing those, I really want to know what can be done, how an AI can do exercise prescription trained on these data, if those could be made accessible. Because all the studies done on those response and prescription all suffer from, like, they can maximally test one or two variables at a time. I desperately want to see where that is going. I mean, the problem is, like you kind of alluded to it, the data sets probably exist to allow us to actually identify a lot of predictive factors, for example, even for injury or for other things. The data are there, but they're in these silos. And often those silos are owned by companies. And of course, it's not necessarily in their interest to share the data set. And there can be some legal issues.
And then, of course, you have GDPR and are the people actually providing their data with consent and all of these things. So the obstacle there is not the lack of data, it's the lack of
permeability,
ability to bring everything together. And so I read a prediction, actually, I think it was about stroke, but you can apply it to any kind of field, that basically within a 24-hour period, if you had the admittance data for all stroke patients in the world, and you put all of their kind of background life factors and then information about the diagnosis and then how they respond to treatment into a big model, you could actually train these amazing sort of individualized models
for stroke prediction
within 1 or 2 days worth of data, because it's so common. It's just that those data are, like I said, in silos all around the world. And in the medical domain, you're not going to find an easy way around that. But one thing that I'm really excited about at the moment is synthetic data. And it raises a whole load of ethical questions. So synthetic data basically is fake data that is constructed with similar properties to real data. So, for example, if I were to measure from you, let's say, muscle activity, I could input that to a generative model. So my model is being trained on your muscle activity data, and then I can get it to output a synthetic signal that looks kind of similar and has some similar properties.
And that dodges the GDPR issue.
That data is synthetic, it's fake, it doesn't belong to anybody. And so that could be a tool, and actually this is already being used in the medical domain.
That is fucking amazing.
It's an incredible thing, but it also raises all of these massive ethical queries, because at what point is the data then no longer kind of attached to a person? So if I measure something from you and then I modify that signal by whatever 2%, is that then your data anymore, or is it now some synthetic data that doesn't belong to anyone? We haven't got around to the kind of regulatory guidelines on any of this, because these are new techniques. But in terms of this idea of bringing together all these cool data sets from around the world and then training these predictive models, that's one way you could do it.
So a lot of these training apps that store workout data and test data for individuals, oh my fucking God.
You think about how many, there are 8 billion people in the world. So quite a few of them nowadays have smart devices that are monitoring something about their movement. You could have hundreds of millions of data points per day on various kinds of training, and nowadays you can get at the sleep data as well, because like in Finland there's a company called Aura with the
I have had a ring.
You know, you can almost literally 24/7 monitor what people are doing.
Yeah.
What's their state of mind? How well have they slept? How have they exercised? All of these things. But, you know, the data are there. It's a case of harnessing it.
Yeah. So it's much more a question of the accessibility of data to train the models on than on the abilities of the models themselves. Is that correct?
Yeah, to an extent. I mean, the other thing you have to take into account is how structured are the data. So
they have to be labeled and.
Yeah, I mean there is that issue that, let's say you've got a polar heart rate monitor and you've uploaded 10 hours of data today. I would need to write algorithms to try and predict what you were actually doing during that whole time, unless you label it all. Which
so tell it when you slept and when you were at work, and
you know, realistically, not everybody's going to do that.
No.
And quite often you're not doing anything special. Right now we're just sitting down talking.
Yeah. But that could be done by cross-referencing.
Well, see, this is the thing. How do you actually verify the ground truth of what they were doing all day long? Even if you asked people in the evening, okay, take me through your day, tell me what you were doing, they're not going to remember everything. And so you're always going to have these gaps. And so, yeah, that's one big issue, is that how structured are the data? But when you're working with team sports, for example, if you're giving the team wearable devices during the training sessions, then it's easier to get these more structured data.
Yeah. So I'm imagining this. You're pretty busy at the time. You're getting a lot of weird mails and phone calls at the time.
Well, yeah. So I actually wear a lot of hats. I'm in our faculty. I'm the vice dean for research as well. So
okay.
I have that sort of takes up the bulk of my time, and then when I have any spare time, I'm working on these issues.
Yeah. Is there any? Where does one follow the development of AI and bot technology in sports applications these days? If there is any place to follow it?
Yeah, and it's, to be honest, it's quite a high anxiety discipline with AI, because it's so fast moving. For me, there's various platforms. So social media, you know, generally something cool happens, it starts to filter through.
Yeah.
And so ChatGPT is one example. A month ago, nobody knew what that was, and then all of a sudden it exploded to the point that even school teachers are talking about how it should be used already, even though it was released a few weeks ago. So social media is one. I try to read papers, especially on these kind of preprint servers. There's a lot of pros and cons about preprint.
Oh, just to keep up?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But in computer science, a lot of stuff appears first on a preprint before they peer review it, because they want it to be out there immediately.
Huh.
Like, for example, we had a paper which was in this AI remote rehabilitation field. It was accepted last week, but it was in peer review for 9 or 10 months.
Damn.
And so if you've done something cool and innovative and nobody gets to see it for that long, in this field, that's a huge amount of time.
Yeah.
Somebody else could come out with a better algorithm in 9 months that does something similar to yours, maybe a bit better, by which time you've lost out on that.
Yeah, so that's a way of moving a lot of chairs around. I hope you can bear with it out there. Actually, I don't have any more questions.
Okay.
My mind is boggled enough as it is.
Yeah, it raises a lot more questions the more you talk about it. But it's an exciting field, and it's already changing the world. It's going to keep changing the world in the near future.
Yeah. Obviously. Well, thank you very much for your time. Last question. Can you recommend any subreddits or Twitter feeds or something to follow to keep up?
Yeah, I don't know that. I mean, you can go to the kind of the godfathers, if you like, in this field. So there's people like there's a guy called Andrew Ng, NG surname, who did one of the first open online courses in machine learning and in deep learning and things. his courses are very good, but also he explains brilliantly, I think, kind of the concepts and new methods and things in AI.
Yeah.
Andrej Karpathy is another guy who has actually... Karpathy, so Karpathy.
Okay.
So he's kind of another godlike figure in this field who's done a lot of work on the ground with actual algorithm development and worked with some of the biggest companies in this area. And if you start there and then you know, on Twitter, for example, it will give you other suggestions of who you should follow, but you need to kind of also limit yourself a little bit. You can spend all day going down the rabbit hole. There's so much cool stuff out there. So.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very
Where
much.
can the listeners follow you if you'd like anyone to follow your work?
Well, for example, on Twitter, my handle is Neil J. Cronin 84. That's probably the place I'm most active when I get a little bit of spare time.
Yeah.
I tweet a little bit about AI-related work. So.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Vi er stadigvæk på Sportskongres, og jeg har fået lov til at fange Billy Sperlich fra Tyskland. Vi gør det her på engelsk, så resten af interviewet det kommer selvfølgelig til at foregå på engelsk. So I'm sitting here with you, Billy, and I scouted you from the program, from the session you're involved with called Wearable Sensor Technology in Sports Medicine, State of the Art and Future Applications. Yeah, that's the listeners of this podcast. A lot of those people have been writing us with questions about wearables. So I'm really interested where we're going with this. But first of all, thanks for for allowing us to borrow 15 or 20 minutes of your time and just do like a presentation of yourself.
Yes, thank you. Well, it's a pleasure being here. So I'm a researcher in exercise physiology. And one of my main topics is, I have many athletes and patients as well, and they ask, of course, how can I improve performance and health? And improving performance and health is a process over time. And in order to set goals and maybe to adjust certain exercise or certain interventions, of course you need a certain type of information. And wearable technology is a good source of information just to judge whether a person's adapting the way you want the person to adapt. And it really doesn't matter if it's an athlete or a patient or someone who maybe wants to improve body composition. Wearables itself, it depends on the sensor, of course, on the variable. Will help, or that's at least my approach, will give me some sort of information to adjust my course of action. And that's a little bit my background, my current research topics on which type of information do I need to adjust my course of action, my training, my lifestyle. That's my current research topic.
So do you work with this only in the scope of science, or do you also do consulting outside of that with the athletes?
Well, yeah, indirectly. Of course, coaches come up and say, hey, there's a new technology here, a new wearable. Can I use it? How can I use it? Is it necessary? How valid? How reliable is the data? And of course, on that level, there's a constant consultancy on my side, because I scan in my daily routine. We scan new technologies, and then we usually buy a new type of wearable, and then
sometimes we do.
and then we do just the easy validation against a certain reference method, and of course.
Yeah. So it's I guess it's at least from the outside perspective, it's a difficult space to maneuver in, because there's a lot of commercial interests at play, and they try to push in part the importance of measuring X, Y, or Z parameter, and where it probably usually isn't as relevant or as important as they claim. And then there's the whole area of problems with the construct validity of what they're
Yes.
like the sensitivity and specificity of the measuring device itself. And I know that, I mean, for most of the commercially available gadgets or wearables, I've seen that when you look at the validation studies compared against gold standard measurement techniques, they usually fare poorly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. When I started, let's say about 10 years ago, I started being more interested in wearable technology, but my motivation was a little bit a different kind. And I think if I explain a little bit how I've evolved, you will understand a little bit how my perspective is on wearables. So 10 years ago, I was really, or I'm still really into one main question is a little bit, what is the difference between high-intensity exercise and moderate continuous exercise? Just to a little bit identify the differences.
In adaptations?
In various forms, in physiology, biomechanics, perception, and so on.
And we're in the domain of cardiorespiratory sports?
Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. So, and in every study, you have a huge variation in adaptation. You have some subjects really having brilliant adaptation. Some do not adapt at all. And in my field, we call those high responders and low responders, moderate or non or late or early responders, name it whatsoever. But what always comes up is the genetic weapon. It's everything linked to genetics. Adaptation is linked to genetics, and I started to, let's say, discuss with athletes and with patients what they do within a 24-hour cycle. And what I found out at that time is there are persons who are highly active during free time, or what I call during off training, were really active off court. And some are just couch potatoes. So athletes and patients are just, they're a quite heterogeneous group themselves. So I started, okay, there's some really, really confounding factors in a typical research design. When we want to identify differences, let's say 3 training sessions per week over time, versus one training versus another training. And if you just have that perspective, 3 hours per week, that sums up to about 3% of your waking time. So just to grasp, your intervention is you manipulate 3% of the waking time of a person, and you look at this, at the stress or at this manipulation over 8 weeks, maybe 10 weeks. And then you try to do the typical pre-post statistical analysis, and you try to find out differences. And you completely link the adaptation to those 3% of waking time. Yeah. But to be honest, even in my laboratory, I have no clue what our subjects do within the next 97% of time. Of course, there's some, we provide diaries and say, okay, please give us some information on what you eat and how your free time activity is and so on. But to be honest, we have no idea really. And from there on, I started to being interested in continuous monitoring, because I was interested in what happens within the 23 hours, let's say when they exit my laboratory. I just wanted to know how active are they, and we find highly, highly active patients, highly active athletes actually. And in an athletic perspective, it's quite interesting. Or as a coach, you would be interested to know how active somebody is during free time activity, and especially in a patient environment as well. And that's when I started to look for technology providing me this information. And of course, as a researcher, you find a technology which could be interesting. There might be one validation study already occurring, and then you start to do a second study, a third study, a fourth study. And that's when I personally started with wrist-worn heart rate monitors, because it's easier for some populations. Data is uploaded and pre-analyzed and so on. Of course, you generate other issues with this type of measurement as well. But that's how I started with wearables. So my background or my idea is, as a researcher, just a little bit to have more information on the confounding factors, because as a researcher, we try to control these confounding factors, but to be honest, a free-living patient, it's impossible. In an animal study, it's easier, but not in free-living, in a free-living population.
So you're actually making the confounding factors the focus of your study.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if you sum it up, exactly, completely. Yeah. So I'm interested in all types of technology around physical activity, maybe sleep. Sleep is I think a big issue, because it's a very complex phenomenon, sleep, and we cannot. Let's say, bottom line, we cannot measure sleep with accelerometers. It's not the right. That's kind of like measuring your body weight with a thermometer. It's basically the complete wrong device. But still, there might be some information in the signal. But sleep, or even more complex, fatigue. Fatigue is very complex. Or in soccer, for example, readiness is a topic, but readiness cannot be measured just by one single variable. Or so you need a little bit more information. But I'm not totally interested in that. For me, it's important a little bit to know what my population, how they engaged, especially in physical activity, because an active person will have different blood flow. Different blood flow will interfere with metabolites and so on. So if you want to know the changes over time, let's say in cardiovascular health, then of course you would like to know what the heart rate, for example, is within a 24-hour cycle, not only during training but also during off training. And that was a little bit my today's message, was just to have an idea of what happens a little bit off, or having just an idea of additional information. That's the one part. And then the other, I just have the feeling that the marketing has flipped a little bit. Marketing has flipped in a direction. Hey, listen, cool, we have a new gadget. What can we do with the gadget? And I think that's completely the wrong question. The question should be, I have a problem, I'm diabetic, or I want to run a marathon, or I want to improve my marathon time. That would be my problem. Or I have high blood pressure, or I have a, let's say, knee injury, and I'd like to improve, let's say, pain or decrease pain. So the minute I have a problem, usually then you can decide on a certain model, how you can solve this type of problem, and then you decide on the technology, but you also decide on whether do I need technology or not. So it's a little bit, the pressures is moved in a different direction. It's like, hey, there's a new gadget, a new device. This could be used for ABCD, and then all of a sudden we're creating problems which we didn't have before. It should be the other way around. It should be, I have a problem, then I find a model, a concept, a framework to solve this problem, and maybe you will choose a certain type of technology, but maybe just perception could solve your issue as well, just by having questions, for example, a questionnaire. You don't necessarily maybe need technology. But for several areas, I would say wearable technology is a key element. But it's not like, just because a smartwatch beeps, you would change your attitude. It's kind of like the minute you wake up in the morning, you know how good you slept. You don't need a device for that. And just because your device tells you, hey, your fitness is going down, I don't have no clue how they measure, a smartwatch would measure decrease in performance. you're still the master of your action in that sense. So I think it's more technology driven than problem solving driven currently.
Would you, should maybe even push that to marketing driven? Then
absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. So I have an anecdote that may play into that. So I've been suffering from insomnia. I had my stint with an Aura ring.
Okay.
So there's an Aura as like a ring for the listeners with temperature thermometer and as accelerometer and some saturation, oxygen saturation measurement, and I also started doing a pretty detailed diary of what supplements I consumed when I stopped working and when I've been working out, when I went to bed, for how long it took for me to fall asleep approximately, and when I woke up and when I got up, and if I were awoken during the night, and then I rate my perception of how good I feel in the morning on a scale of 1 to 5. And after using the Aura for 4 months or something like that, I found that the Aura provides some scores on readiness, and I found that it didn't actually give me any information that I didn't get from my
plus
massive spreadsheet.
These scores, there's so many companies now, because they all have accelerometers or near infrared measurement, and basically they more or less have similar raw data. So in order to distinguish startup A from startup B, you will start creating some, I don't want to say fake numbers, some fantasy numbers. That's probably the right, some just fantasy score or ratio or index. And as a researcher, I hardly know what the rationale is behind this number. That's another issue I'm seeing, that we're creating, let's say, data which we really don't know on how to interpret, because it's an integrative, maybe variable from different signal sources, and I have no clue. For sleep, there's some index or recovery index and readiness index, player load, and those are metrics. They're not. I don't know where they come from.
So in a scientific context, those an index like some of those devices provide, would obviously have to be validated against some kind of outcome, and in various population and age groups and which of course is much more difficult than. But on the other hand, the commercial actors at least they drive the technology forward. So I appreciate they have some kind of purpose that contributes something to the whole.
Yeah. That wasn't really a question. I was just mind farting. Yeah.
So, what kind of monitors have you been working with in tracking offline
exactly.
activity?
So it's not so much driven from a research perspective. It's more driven from how you can handle devices and how you can handle the data, for example. From a scientist perspective, how you compile? Not so much, because see, for me, my interest is what type of device can a subject or a patient wear or use. So I have more or less reliable or valid data, but especially in older patients or depending on the population, you need devices which have a good connectivity, which are waterproof, which have a good battery life.
Like basic functionality.
Very basic. It's simple. It's fire and forget. It's you turn the device on and you don't have to deal with anything else. So that actually kills a lot of more scientific, more validated, and maybe more assessed variables so far. So that's actually, for me, the key question when I choose a device. Is battery life at least 3 days, 2 to 3 days, just because subjects get annoyed just from charging or from uploading data every time. So that kind of kills a lot of devices. Waterproof is important in elite athletes. It's also roaming costs depending on where they are in training camps. So if you're in several countries, it could be very, very expensive uploading huge amount of data. So that's sometimes an issue if you don't have a real, let's say, wireless internet connection. Then it's also a little bit related to, do I have access to at least a certain form of raw data? Not any, let's say, pre-calculated data.
Processed.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the next a little bit issue we have. And then, how in the everyday use, how good it can be used. And you have other issues. For example, in females, if it's not close to a jewelry or something you would wear, more or less 24/7, it's useless because you cannot wear a clumsy smartwatch maybe in certain profession. It just doesn't work. Or some subjects don't like to wear a watch at night. So then maybe your ring could be a solution, but maybe not 24-hour, but maybe for 8-hour measurement or 10-hour. So it's a little bit finding a certain type of, now I'm using the word ecosystem, a certain type of, let's say, orchestra of devices I can use just to provide as good as I can valid and reliable data.
Yeah. So can I just shoot some different wearables at you?
Yeah.
What do you think of something like the Stride power meter? You know this one?
Yeah, by Stride, it's...
so it measures forces in the step points for runners.
Yes, exactly. So I'd throw that ball back to biomechanics and say, okay, what the real biomechanic departments will say to that. I personally... I can understand maybe a little bit the discussion about the question on measuring power or power output, because I think just from physics it's not the right term basically, but still it could be a proxy for power output. I've never really used the Stride device, but still, if the data is reliable but maybe not valid, you still can use it for a certain type of information. The question but I have behind that is what your model is, how you judge success or failure. That's the main question you will have. And if you have a model and this technology will assist your model, why not use it, or at least try and see what happens. But the metrics coming out, I understand the discussions on, is it, let's say, comparable to a power meter on a bike? Of course it cannot. It's from physics, it just doesn't feel right.
No. The reason I'm asking is because I've had a lot of questions about it, and
Stride,
I don't know, man. I mean, have you ever worked with any of the devices for measuring oxygen saturation peripherally, like through the skin?
Yes, actually, that's one of my most, let's say, one of my populations I'm working with are athletes engaging in high altitude training. And in order to judge responders and non-responders, of course, we can use, punctual blood measurements.
Responders for high altitude training?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And especially how you, little bit adjust training intensity at high altitude? That's always a question among coaches.
Okay.
So usually when you exercise in sea level, and you go to, let's say, 2,000 meter, 2,500 meters, there are some athletes who quite well compensate the altitude, and some are really struggling. And so far, we've used just the morning saturation measurements and questionnaires and maybe one or two easy blood sample variables.
So do they have measurable drops in saturation at that height?
Well, the really good coaches, yeah. If we go with good training, with training teams, they usually measure.
But do they actually drop from 109?
It could. Well, it's not like they drop to 80, but they will go down to 80. I've measured 80 or below 80% in oxygen saturation during high intensity interval training.
Bike or running?
In running, I've seen really strong decrease.
That's amazing, actually.
Yeah, I really have. But I've also seen athletes who do not react more or less at all. So they usually have their nightly 90% maybe or 92%, and over time they
get back to the 90s.
They come back. But what I'd like to have is something. Let's say I'd like to have a variable which is comparable to heart rate. You know, I have a 24-hour oxygen saturation measurement, and so far the ones you can rely more or less on are the fingertip measurements. You know,
Yep.
But they're clumsy and it really doesn't work quite good. Some manufacturers now measure at night because they need more or less a calm measurement situation. They don't like artifacts, movement of the device. Okay, that's the next level of information. But what I'd like to have is really a line, a 5, 6, 7, 8 week line, pre-high altitude, altitude, and post-altitude. And it's not like you would be able to judge a real responder and non-responder, but at least it will give me some information on, okay, maybe this person should stay a week longer. Maybe this person will need a different type of exercise or training sessions in the beginning. This person needs more adaptation over time. So you can have more information coming out of that. So the saturation, yes, I'm quite interested in. The peripheral measurements, there are some devices on it. You can measure on your leg or calf. And
I can't remember the one for legs. What is it? Can you remember the name?
One is called Moxie. Moxie measurements. I've been using NIRS measurements now for many, many years, and for some
near-infrared
spectroscopy, yes. And it's a certain level of information as well. But of course, you have the devices have some issues. They're similar to EMG measurements. The minute you take the device off and put it back on, it's a total different story. It's not like heart rate in that sense, but still to have some idea on desaturation during high intensity exercise, during altitude training camps, just to have an idea. And then you can discuss the data, and you can provide information to a coach and to an athlete. That's fine.
Yeah,
that's okay.
So I'm kind of I don't know what to call it, retro romantic. I'm a little averse to and it's an aesthetic preference, but I really want to be convinced that I'm wrong. So can you describe a situation or one where a case where people have made good use of biomarkers from wearables for better training, better life, better? Can you make a case? What is if you're trying to sell the idea on someone? What would the example be you would use?
Okay, don't get me wrong. I'm not a nerd tech, not at all. I personally, the only thing I really track from my own are just steps per day.
Yeah.
I know my smartwatch is okay. There are some situations where the smartwatch is just not measuring correctly. but still, if for a longer period of time, if I'm below 8,000 steps per day, my body weight will go up just a little. And the minute I'm above 8,000, but that's me personally. That's not a general number. Please don't get me wrong. When I'm in the 11,000 steps per day range, my body weight is constant over many weeks. And the minute I have more sitting time, or I'm more inactive, my body weight just goes up a little. That's my case, if you want. Other than that, I'm the advocate. First, define your problem. That's the very first question. And a problem could be, I need a higher pace during interval training. I need to control my blood sugar. I need to know on a longer scale my blood pressure. I have maybe sleeping issues whatsoever. If you've defined your problem, then you need a good, and I think that's the issue for the companies, you need a good idea of models, of a framework solving that issue. And then you decide on the technology. And I would say it will assist in solving, but it will not solve your problem itself. Because just simple, if you have issues with sleeping, then it just could be just simple things like stop using your smartphone in bed, or developing a routine. That's nothing related to technology. That's just common sense. A little bit. So I totally agree. Very often we're creating problems with wearables we don't really have. That's definitely. Plus, it can be stressful. It can be you can overshoot. The minute you track your sleep, and you're stressed by just tracking your sleep worsens over time. There's data out now as well on that topic, so you can overshoot in that direction as well. Yeah. So, still, define your problem, find the framework, identify the key elements you need in order to solve your problem, and technology might be one of the avenues you take. But of course, just perception, or just calibrating your perception, or just being aware of a certain situation can be more useful than just tracking.
Yeah, that makes sense. Final question. What is your, of course, I had the Aura, and I had a couple of other smartwatches, and I, of course, have a smartphone with a lot of measurements included. What is your experience with trying to get access to the raw data? Because all of these tools, is there any way for regular people to get access to these data?
It's a nightmare. You have to look. It really depends on the company. Sometimes they don't provide any data. Sometimes process data. For some company, actually, you need to pay. You have to pay the software to use. But
I've never really considered an option that was possible. Now that you talk about it, I realize I would really like to get those data myself and see what.
It's not all companies provide that information. And personally, if you're a really large company, and basically, I would say. Big population is using the data, I think the company should provide open access data for research, just to. Do
you know of anyone that provides it more easily than others?
Well, there are some company on a research scale. Yes, they provide.
But
let's
not
say
for commercial.
That's a question I cannot totally answer, but I know companies provide a certain type of database, and you can use machine learning and let's say advanced statistical analysis maybe to identify some certain or you can answer some questions. But it's really difficult. Plus also not only access to your data, but usually you have process data, and we don't know what the process data looks like. And every time there's an update in the software, I get shaky because I never know what how the algorithms have changed.
No.
Yeah.
Okay, so that'll be. I I never looked at the documentation or the APIs for any of the wearables, but maybe there's a hole somewhere to pull something out.
Usually you'll find in some blogs or somebody already has looked for access, and you most probably will find some way. But not for all companies. Okay. That's definitely the case, yeah.
Okay. I think that was all. Thank you very much for letting us borrow you. Could you just, if you want anyone to, any listeners to follow your work, let us know where they can find you.
Yeah, follow me on Twitter. That's the easiest, on Billy Sperlich. That's usually where I also post often some information about wearables. And then if you like, follow my website on www.sportsandscience.de. I have some information around training process, exercise. Don't worry, it is in German, but there's a lot of content in English as well. So you just need to look for the English titles.
Yeah, but these days the browsers offer
translation,
pretty good direct live translation. Exactly. So it's not a
good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm the one saying thank you. Yeah. Have a nice day. Jeg har fået lov til at fange Finn Johansen, som jeg kender tilbage fra min tid på idrætsmedicin. Og det er torsdag her på Sportskongres, og i morgen der skal han holde et oplæg om behandling af tendinopatier. Titlen er Treatment of Tendinopathy with Physical Training, Glucocorticoids and Surgery, Helpers or Enemies. Og nu kan jeg få dig til at lave sådan en suppeterning af dit oplæg, med fare for at foregribe begivenhedernes gang. Og du behøver ikke holde igen med sådan noget teknik og fagsprog, fordi vi har mange fagfolk blandt lytterne også.
Yes. Jeg er chair på den session i morgen, men jeg skal holde et foredrag omkring kortikosteroidinjektion. Så det er ikke, jeg skal ikke holde foredrag omkring træningen eller operationen. Det er der andre, der gør. Men altså, for at summe det hele op, så er det jo, at vi prøver i samarbejde at behandle de her patienter med tendinopati. Og det er jo et stort problem for sportsfolk, tendinopatier. Og der er det så, at standardbehandlingen, det er, at det skal trænes væk. Og det er enormt svært med sportsfolk at prøve at træne noget væk, uden samtidig at overbelaste endnu mere. Med mindre man er meget har stor pondus til at lave load reduction, altså aflaste det væv, som er overbelastet. Og for mig er det lang tid, det skal aflastes. Og jeg tror måske en af de...
Hvad er lang tid? Altså hvis man taler om et springerknæ eller sådan en Achilles tendinopati?
Når jeg behandler mine patienter, og vi snakker kortikosteroid, så er det 3 måneder no jumping, no running. Det så er, det er, at man prøver så på at træne de her tendinopatier. Og det er jo signifikant forbedring, de får alle sammen. Men mine patienter er ikke interesseret i p-værdier. De er interesseret i at blive kureret. Så selvom de får en p-værdi på under 0,05, og de bliver bedre, så er det ikke nok for mine patienter. Så man kan simpelthen se, når man træner nogle af de her scener her, at de bliver bedre. Men op mod 45% er ikke tilfredse. Og hvad gør vi så? Skal vi bare træne dem videre? 3-6 måneder? Det hjælper måske et par få ekstra. Men der er det så min filosofi, at så må vi prøve at supplere måske med kortikosteroid. Så for mig er kortikosteroid en supplement til den behandling, som man har iværksat med aflastning og med træning. Og når jeg så gør det på den måde, så kan jeg jo se, at det hjælper mine patienter. Jeg har lavet studier på akillessener og på fascia plantaris, at det hjælper markant på dem, når man laver den mere pragmatisk indstilling til det. Med netop at kombinere træning, aflastning og steroidinjektion. Det, der er lavet en masse af studier på, det er at bruge steroid som monoterapi. Altså bare give en sprøjte og se, om det hjælper. Det betyder jo så, at der må være en eller anden form for steroidmangelsyndrom. Ja. Det har jeg aldrig hørt om, nemlig. Ikke hvad sportsfolk angår. Så det alene som monoterapi, det mener jeg ikke er nogen terapi. Så det, der sker, når man giver sådan en steroid, det er, at vævet, det ændrer sig markant. Normaliseres næsten på en måned. Og symptomerne forsvinder markant. Og så tror patienten, nu er jeg rask. Og så går de ud og løber et maraton eller spiller fodbold igen. Og så går det galt. Og derfor er det fået et kedeligt rygte, det her steroid. Det bliver simpelthen værre bagefter. Det virker rigtig godt i short term, det kan man se på alle studier, men det virker dårligt long term. Og det er fordi, der ikke er ordentlig compliance til at lave load reduction. Eller de er slet ikke blevet informeret om det. Så i min studie, hvor jeg laver seriøst load reduction i 3 måneder, og laver en kontrolleret optræning, så ser du faktisk ud til at virke rigtig godt på kort sigt og på lang sigt. Og det er i modsætning til mange andre studier, hvor at Coombs og Bisset og også Coupé på Bispebjerg har lavet et studie, som viser, at det faktisk bliver værre på sigt med tennisalbuerne, er det især, de studerer på. Det virker godt på kort sigt, men på lang sigt er det dårligere end at lave placebobehandling eller wait and see. Og der er det så, at...
Hvad siger de nationale kliniske retningslinjer om brugen af steroider til tendinopatier egentlig?
Ja, altså de kliniske retningslinjer til akillessener siger i hvert fald, at det er second line treatment. Ikke first line, second line treatment. Så man må gerne bruge steroid. Der er ikke noget farligt i det. Bare man bruger det ordentligt. Fredberg lavede et studie i 2004, hvor han havde netop akillessener, patellasener med, hvor han efter at have givet dem, altså de fik 3 sprøjter, alle sammen skulle have 3 sprøjter i det studie. Der kan man sige, det skal de ikke hos mig. Jeg er pragmatiker. Hvis en sprøjt hjælper, og de kan træne, så skal de ikke have mere. Og sådan er det også i min studie. Det er velbeskrevet, hvordan jeg gør det, og så kan man efterligne det også. I det studie så lavede de aggressiv rehabilitering, hvor de kunne løbe efter få dage. Og der var der så også en ruptur ud af de 40 patienter, han er med i en akillessene, og det får de ikke hos mig. Der er ingen ruptur. Jeg har haft hundredvis af patienter med. Der er ingen, der får ruptur, selvom vi laver heavy slow resistance training efter 2 dage. Men det er ikke excentrisk high impact træning, som med løb og hop. Så for mig er det aflastning, der er det vigtigste. Og i de studier, der ellers ligger, hvor man har prøvet at træne samtidig med, at man har givet steroid, der er load reduction, altså kun en uge, eller få dage, eller 2 uger. Og det mener jeg måske er det store årsag til de forskelle, der er i studierne. Altså, hvad er det egentlig, vi gør forskelligt? Og så er det måske lige det lille issue, at tennisalbuer er måske noget andet end alt det andet. Tennisalbuer, det er sådan en sjov aponeurose, som jo overhovedet ikke ligner en akillessene, eller en ligamentum patellae, eller en gluteus medius, eller noget andet. Så er det samme? Måske er vævet anderledes, og det ser også ud til, at ved tennisalbuen, jamen altså, fysioterapi eller wait and see, det er lige så godt. Steroid som monoterapi, det er godt på kort sigt, det er dårligere på lang sigt. Så lad være med det som monoterapi. Og hvis du skal lave det, så er det altså load reduction. Kom væk fra hammeren, kom væk fra catcheren i flere måneder, og så lave noget anden træning til at få at stimulere vævet til at blive bedre.
I forhold til det her med load reduction, tænker du så, at der skal skelnes mellem altså high impact og low impact? Altså man kan godt lave styrketræning udført langsomt, som har markant lavere spidsbelastninger end løb og spring og kast og sådan noget har.
Ja, det er lige nok det, jeg tænker på. Det er faktisk, om det så er vibrationerne, der er årsagen til det, eller det er den der spidsbelastning, excentrisk belastning, der er årsagen. Det ved jeg ikke. Men jeg holder mig fra det, som vi tror er årsagen til, de får skaderne in the first place. Det er jo catcheren, det er hammeren, det er de vibrationer, der bræger op i tennisalbuen. Det er de vibrationer, der kommer ned fra fodisættet, når man hopper og når man løber, som går op i fascia plantaris, i akillessenen, i skinnebenen, i senerne der, helt op i ligamentum patellae. Så væk fra det. Det er det, der er for meget. Og så lave det langsomt, kontrolleret.
Altså den måde, du beskriver det på, der lyder sådan mere empirisk, end det lyder sådan evidensagtigt. Altså altså det giver mening, det du siger. Altså det har altid faldet mig for brystet, at man ser de der reklamer for Voltaren-gel, hvor så tager folk deres Voltaren-gel, fordi så kan de fortsætte med at gøre det, de nogle gange var i gang med. Det er sådan lidt det samme fænomen her.
Jeg siger jo netop, at de ikke skal fortsætte med det, der er for meget. Det er for mig at se, man kan spørge sig selv om, det med at lave fysioterapi, træning, måske er det at underholde patienten indtil tiden helbreder sygdommen. Ja. Det er der ingen, der ved. Det kan også være, at steroiden er det samme. Det kan være, at operationen er det samme. At man simpelthen opererer, og så kan patienten godt forstå, at nu skal det lige aflaste det her lidt, og så genoptræne. Så måske er det hele fidusen, det er at få en compliance til load reduction, og så gradvis optræning bagefter igen. Træning tager tid. Det tager tid at komme sig over en senebetændelsestilstand, en seneirritationstilstand. Men det er ikke ren empiri, fordi jeg har sådan set lavet studier på det her. Jeg har lavet studier, der ligger 3 randomiserede studier, som jeg får selv om i morgen, hvor man simpelthen kan dokumentere, at det har en effekt det her. Faktisk på fascia plantaris, der er det nærmest additiv effekt til træning og steroid. Så de 2 ting lagt sammen, det er nærmest dobbelt så godt.
Jeg strammede den også lidt. Jeg skulle trykke dig lidt på maven. Ja. Men det jeg ville frem til, det var egentlig, altså hvad er det, hvordan er det, du siger her, hvordan er det i forhold til state-of-the-art-evidensen og evidensen på meta-analyseniveau, som jo typisk er nogle år forsinket? Altså, er det her, du tror, der kommer til at blive det, der står i nationale kliniske retningslinjer i forskellige lande om 5 år, for eksempel?
Ja, der er jo nogle lande, hvor det er nærmest forbudt at give en sprøjt til en akillescene. USA tør de ikke, fordi at det bliver sagsanlæg, hvis der kommer en ruptur. Så jeg tror heller ikke, man gør det i Sverige, og i England er man meget, meget bekymret for at gøre det også. Men jeg har lavet et studie på 100 mennesker randomiseret til placebo eller til steroidinjektion, fuldstændig triple-blinded. Ingen vidste, hvad de fik, heller ikke datakollektorerne eller statistikerne, og det viser, at der er signifikant bedre effekt af at give steroid og heavy slow resistance træning i forhold til placebo og heavy slow resistance træning. Det var artikel i JAMA.
Når du taler om det her med at neddrosle træningsbyrde, hvis man tager sådan noget som volleyballspillere, der jo kraftedeme har springerknæ ind af en kant, tænker du, at de godt kan blive, altså når man taler om neddrosling, tænker du, at de godt kan fastholde deres styrketræning-regimen under hensyntagen til lave spidsbelastninger? Altså at man fastholder den del, men det er springbelastningen, man tænker kun? Ja,
de skal væk fra boxjump og jump squat og masser af spring.
Og volleyball.
Og volleyball også, men så skal de lave, de kan jo godt, ikke volleyball, de kan godt lave boldbehandlings, de kan lave serve, de kan lave masser af grundslag, og så kan de lave masser af styrketræning for resten af systemet, mens de venter på, at andet det heler, og de skal så stimulere det væv også langsomt kontrolleret, og så gradvist tilbage til den spidsbelastning, de gerne vil tilbage til. Men det tager tid.
Har man nogen mulighed for at måle, hvor tæt man er på at komme tilbage? Altså sådan, hvornår man kan introducere?
Ja, men det er jo det, der er skide svært. Sådan er det jo med al optræning. Når du starter på at vil løbetræne, så skal du også starte langsomt, og så prøver du at øge lidt langsomt på det. Og når du så kan løbe 5 km, så kan du prøve at løbe 6. Du skal ikke lige pludselig gå fra 5 til 10 eller fra 10 til 20. Så du skal langsomt progredere din træning, og så er det, du så på den måde mærker på dit egen krop, hvornår vi er klar til at komme videre.
Men der er ikke nogen biomarkører, man kan bruge som rettesnor endnu?
Ikke nogen, jeg kender.
Tak, jeg tror, det var det hele. Vil du lige fortælle vores lyttere, det skulle du selvfølgelig have gjort i starten, men det var mig, der glemte det, det beklager meget, men hvem du er, hvor du arbejder, og hvad du arbejder med og sådan noget?
Ja, Finn Johansen hedder jeg, jeg er rheumatolog, det vil sige en medicinmand. Men jeg bruger ikke så meget steroid som mange andre, selvom det lyder sådan, når jeg laver forskning i det. Jeg har haft en klinik i Farum i 25 år nu, hvor jeg har behandlet masser af patienter. Jeg tror, det er 40.000 CPR-numre, jeg har behandlet derude. Og så er jeg samtidig på Bispebjerg, hvor jeg er klinisk forsker, eller laver forskning i patienter. Meget pragmatisk forskning, hvor det ligesom ikke alle skal behandles ens, men de skal behandles ud fra de symptomer, de har. Og hvis de får god forbedring ved at få en sprøjt, så skal de ikke have 2 sprøjter, for eksempel. Og det studie, vi har i gang nu, altså det tidligere studie, jeg har lavet, der startede vi alle sammen fik 1 sprøjt. Men det betyder jo så også, at hvis der kun er halvdelen, der har brug for det, så vil det medføre, at det vasker resultatet lidt ud. Det gør resultatet svagere egentlig. Så nu laver vi et studie på Bispebjerg også, hvor vi først prøver at træne dem med akillessenerne, og dem, som ikke kommer igennem og bliver tilfredse med det, de får så en sprøjte med steroid. Og det tror jeg måske er den rigtige måde at gøre det på. Det er sådan, jeg gør det i min daglige praksis.
Tak for din tid, og når du nu ikke selv siger det, så tør jeg godt sige det på din vej. Du er også en veteran i det danske idrætsmedicinske miljø.
Ja, tak.
Tak for din tid.
Det er godt, du. Tak.
Yeah, I'm sitting here at the Sportskongres with Rhodri Lloyd, who's been involved in 2 sessions here called Maturation and Performance in Youth Sports, which is always an interesting topic. So first of all, can you give a presentation to the listeners who you are and where you're doing and how you came around doing that?
Sure. So Yeah, I'm a professor of paediatric strength and conditioning. So I am based at Cardiff Metropolitan University in Wales. And I am part of a research group that focus both our research and our applied practice on essentially the development of athleticism in younger athletes.
And what is younger?
So the youngest children, so we have an after-school program that we run. The youngest we've had come through the centre is probably at the age of 6, and then the oldest will be up to sort of under 18s, under 19s. So quite a large spread that sort of encapsulates childhood and adolescence. So irrespective of the age of the children, we look to promote the development of physical fitness. So whether that's strength and power or speed or mobility and fitness and endurance. And we also then, our research and practice is also directed around reducing the risk of injury. And I suppose I guess one of the strands that permeates all of our research is trying to look at the interaction between growth and maturation and the adaptations that we see as a result of training. So if we're able to make a 10-year-old soccer player faster, stronger, we like to start to unpick why that is happening and what role does maturation and maturity status have in that training response if we expose them to a year-long training intervention. So it's a really interesting field, but it also has challenges along the way as well.
So when you're talking about maturation, is that like physiological maturation or in the widest possible scope?
Our research group, I mean, the different systems within the body will mature at different rates. We tend to have a focus on biological maturation. Okay. So the process of children growing from childhood through adolescence, experiencing the adolescent growth spurt, and how does a child going through that phase of development, what does that do to them in terms of potentially changing the way they move? Are they more sensitive to different types of training? Are they at more risk of injury during that stage? So they're a unique population, training younger athletes, because for a senior level athlete, an adult athlete, you would have the training dosage that you give and the type of adaptation that you get. But with children, the addition of maturation is an interesting factor to weave into the research and our practice. Yeah.
So what are the main points that parents and clinicians that are not intimately familiar with that kind of area, what are the main points they should be aware of in this respect?
Yeah, so I guess some of our overarching principles that we have tried to get across in our published work and our presentations and our actual coaching principles would be around starting early. So the premise of children engaging with strength conditioning programs from as early in childhood as possible would be one of our guiding principles.
From a physiological perspective, at least.
True, yeah.
So that, I mean, from a psychological development, there may be some opposition to that, I guess.
Yeah, I think
maybe
from a psychological standpoint, in terms of what we do in terms of our practice, we work with children, and one of the important things is that they are in receipt of developmentally appropriate training. So a training program that we deliver to a 6, 7, 8-year-old is going to look very different to what we would deliver to a 15, 16, 17-year-old. So that's not to say that they can't participate in those types of training. It's just the way in which we deliver, the way in which we interact with the children is going to be different. But they can, the literature is pretty, I guess, clear now that irrespective of the stage of maturation, all children can make meaningful improvements in measures of physical fitness. So, and any, I guess, fears or myths that have surrounded this topic area in the last 30 plus years have really been, sort of shown to or have been shown to, not be the case. So existing fears around children participating in strength training, rather than the misheld myth of it stunting their growth. It actually probably encourages and drives some adaptation around skeletal hardening in terms of bone mineral density. So it's actually the flip reverse. So I think those are things that we've had to battle with over the years as well. But I said the wealth of evidence now, the position statements that are available, hopefully they are, from an education standpoint at least, that we have a lot of good quality evidence now.
Yeah. I think the reason I brought it up, and in Denmark at least, we have a team in Denmark that supports development of athletes. And they have so while they don't engage directly with very young athletes, they have made guidelines for how to address talent development and stuff like that. So the Danish guys at least support that or prescribe that you should develop general fitness and before addressing specific traits, and in most contexts, doing strength and conditioning work would play into the specific parts. So in Denmark we have a kind of a little more laid back that's a political statement of sorts, really. So China, and that is probably different.
And I think if you had if you saw the types of training that we were delivering to the younger athletes that come through our training centre, they are very general types of training.
Yeah, sure.
So in terms of the overarching principles, we try and make all the athletes stronger and more powerful, but that's built on the premise of them being good quality movers as well. So if you actually looked at an annual plan, I've just presented on this in the session now, a lot of our training would fall into the general preparatory phase type training. It would probably only be our older players, once they've been with us for a while, where we would then start to potentially manipulate the training to be a little bit more specific. I'm not a huge fan of that term, but probably more aligned to the specific preparatory phases of training. I tend to refer to it as training relevance rather than training specificity. I don't think the types of training that we prescribe and deliver to the younger athletes has to look like the sport, but we can expose them to types of training that will we can expose them to movements that will give them the right types of kinetics or force them to experience those types of forces, and we try and build their ability to actually probably master movements that don't look anything like the sport, because we're trying to increase their movement vocabulary and their general levels of athleticism.
So I guess that's the first point, to start early. It works, it's safe, it provides the opportunity for more exposure. And
and then I think we would it's about starting early. It's about the importance of movement skill and muscle strength. They have
muscle skill in muscle strength and muscle strength?
And muscle strength. So from a motor skill standpoint, we know that children being able to master fundamental movement skills earlier on in their lives, actually they stand a better chance of staying engaged with sport and physical activity later on in life. And strength is the ability to produce and absorb and dissipate forces is extremely important, just from it's a bit of an umbrella fitness quality. So stronger athletes, that transfers well to speed, it transfers well to explosive strength and power qualities, it makes children more robust, it allows them, it gives them a better chance in terms of tolerating the demands of their sport. So for us, I think the two of the central pillars would be about making them stronger and making them better quality movers. And I think the third thing I would probably highlight would be about keeping the programs fun where appropriate. That's not to say you can't have some serious elements to the program, but when you're working with 7, 8, 9, 10, 11-year-olds, if it's just a very serious program all the time, the kids are not going to want to come back. So a good sign of whether I think you're getting it right is if the kids do show up every week, and if you've got that environment which challenges them, but also allows them as individuals to experience achievement and success along the way, then I think that's the hallmarks of a good program.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, in what is the context that you're administering these programs? Is that as a science project, or are you associated with any of the federations, or is it part of what is the name of the organization in Britain that that supports elite sports?
We have sort of UK sport, and we have different sporting organisations, but it's an after-school program. We have about 140 kids come through our training facility every week, and we are affiliated with a soccer academy as part of our university.
Okay.
But we don't. That doesn't pay our wages. It's the university that pay our wages. I guess we're in a slightly unique position. But what we try to do is ensure that we're delivering good quality programs that hopefully keeps those kids engaged in the sport, and obviously helps to reduce their chances of injury. But the program we run is the Youth Physical Development Centre. That's where we train the children, and that's on the campus of Cardiff Metropolitan University.
Okay.
Is it a science project? Is it just real world coaching? It's actually a bit of both. So as part of their engagement and involvement with the program, we test them throughout the year.
Yeah.
The testing is designed to deliver the most tailored, individualized program we can. But it also doubles up then and provides us with data that we're able to answer research questions with. So it's, I guess, a little bit of a two-prong approach.
Yeah. Is it very soccer-centric?
So previously, pre-COVID, we had different sports. So we had tennis, gymnastics, trampolining, rugby, and others. And then after COVID, we just centralised a little bit. I said we've affiliated with the soccer academy that's part of our university now. So we only really have soccer coming through. That's our main sport. But we will be looking to increase the number of sports that we're working with now, probably in the next 6 months.
Yeah. So can you be more specific in describing what these strength and conditioning programs can look like for a 7 to 8 year old? Because so how to make it playful and still effective and
So the workshop I've just delivered now, we were going through it where we have 1 hour slots with each team, which works out to be about
how many times a week?
So we will do once or twice a week, depending on certain teams and certain clubs. That hour, probably by the time they've come in and they've got sorted and a little bit of time at the end, you're probably looking at about a 45 to 50 minute session of actual work. For the younger children, the majority of that session will be bodyweight type strength and conditioning. So the use of animal shapes, the use of basic gymnastic skills, and some technical work. So they might be doing some more recognized strength training exercises, but they would be using wooden dowels and technique bars to master the movement. And we will also throw in some challenges and games, some engagement tasks. And then as they progress, it's not an age-based decision. It's how those kids are responding, what sort of rate of progression are they showing. We then gradually over time start to switch that emphasis a little bit. So more time is invested on the more recognizable exercises and probably a little bit less time on the sort of the fun-based activities. But it's I guess a little bit of an art form to get that balance. To get that balance right.
Yeah, I can imagine. So you're saying, if I'm understanding you correctly, that you're like progressing the more training with like the intellectual, psychological maturity of the kids. How do you do that on a group scale?
Yeah, so
now you got clever and mature enough to get to the next level, or
yeah. So we wouldn't have a program. So we have peak height velocity as a key reference point in the adolescent growth spurt. So it's that period of time where the child is experiencing, the most rapid rate of change in stature. So, a kid might be growing in a given year 12, 15 centimeters of growth in a given year. Now, if we think of that reference point, we don't have a pre-peak height velocity training program and a post-peak height velocity training. We don't base our training prescription on maturity status. It's one of the ingredients, if you like, that goes into our thought process of programming. So
I thought you were talking about like mental maturity there, but still only biological.
Correct.
Okay,
so,
sorry about that.
How do we then manage a group, whether that is from a psychosocial perspective, whether it's based on biological maturity? I think for me, one of the key terms is differentiation, and that comes from sort of teaching pedagogy, right? So if you've got a class of 25, you're not going to give each child the exact same task because it's going to be too easy for some, it's going to be too difficult for others. And we're able to, within a given training session, even though we might have the same objective, so it might be about a speed stimulus, it might be a strength stimulus, we're able to change the exercises based on the technical abilities and the maturity status at times of the children that we have in front of us.
Okay. Can you say something about the significance that the growth velocity holds for injury and adaptation?
Yeah, so I said that sort of time of peak height velocity, when they're at that rapid rate of, or the greatest change in stature, that's often a red flag for injury risk. So if you think of a child going through that real rapid rate of change in growth, they'll have quite a large differential in terms of skeletal and muscle tissue development. And from a coordination standpoint, that quite often will throw the kids out around that period of growth. So we see an increased risk of growth-related and overuse type injuries around that stage of development.
How much higher is the prevalence during those or that year? Or
so we would see, if you look at some football data, we can see that there's a sort of a peak around that sort of adolescent growth spurt. If it's we see the injuries following the trend of normal growth. So we would expect a distal to proximal change. So initially in the youngest and least mature children at the start of the growth spurt, we're likely to see more sort of severs type injuries around the ankle. And then as they go through their adolescent growth spurt and they go past and towards the end of adolescence, we then see a shift to more proximal injuries around maybe the hip and the lower back. So the data would probably show that around that sort of age of sort of 14 in boys and probably a year and a half to 2 years earlier in females, that period of peak height velocity is a bit of a red flag. It's not a case that peak height velocity equals injury. It's not like a guarantee. It's just the relative risk of injury is heightened, so it's something that we need to manage. But how much
bigger is the relative risk? Is it like a 50% higher compared to 2 years before, or 100% higher?
So we would see a significant rise. So ACL injury risk is quite a good one, even though it's not a growth-related or an overuse type injury. We know that that sort of age of 16, sometimes we'll get kids who are a marked increased risk. So it might be that girls will have a sort of a 6 to 8 times more chances of experiencing that injury once they've gone through that sort of growth.
6 to 8 fold?
Yeah.
Damn.
That is a lot. That risk of injury. So it's all injuries are multidimensional, and everyone is slightly different, but it's a red flag that we need to be mindful of.
Yeah. Do you have any metrics of this, of like generic motor skill? You're talking about the movement vocabulary. Do you have like any, are there any metrics, way to measure, quantify like the the overall motor skill, intelligence of kids?
So we actually wrote a paper in the Strength and Conditioning Journal, which is I guess a little bit more of a practitioner-friendly journal, of a review of different assessments for motor skill ability. So probably the most commonly used, especially within education circles, would be the test of gross motor development, the TGMD, and that's probably some more recognised sort of fundamental movement skills in terms of skipping and jumping and catching.
So that's a panel of tests?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then there's a resistance training skills battery, which again, and all the different types of screens will vary in terms of the number of exercises, the scoring criteria, whether it's a binary 0-1 or whether it's a 1-2-3 or if it's a 0 to 10. And there are different domains. So, if you're looking at the movement, is it just a mark for the overall assessment, or are you actually breaking it down to say what's happening at the knee, what's happening at the hip, what's happening at the shoulders, and so on? So, that review is assessing athletic motor skill competencies. That's available in Strength and Conditioning Journal as a paper.
Yeah. Nice. So. In the culture concerning athlete or sports development, at least here in Denmark, I guess it's the same across the sea. That young kids tend to be more involved, committed to a vision of having a career as an athlete in some way. So, and maybe sometimes in Denmark we see people overcommitting at an early stage. In a way that's detrimental for the long-term development, or maybe the parents are too pushy, because being an athlete or being a sportsman is more of an identity marker. Is that something that you see reflect into the kids and over there as well?
So are you referring to sort of early specialization, is it, or?
Yeah, but committing to an athlete life at a very early stage in life. And I know in Denmark, the Danish Soccer Union, they kind of push it a little bit, while a lot of the other federations for other sports tend to hold back a little. Yeah,
no, I mean, certainly I think while a lot of the research, I think is probably in its infancy, I don't think we've got the top level evidence just yet. The emerging trends in the data will show that early specialization in a single sport can increase the risk of overuse injury in young athletes, and it can actually potentially blunt their athletic abilities. So they become highly skilled in particular movements, but then less skilled and lacking in competency in a range of others. And actually, as well, there's probably been some psychosocial concerns around the increased risk of dropout and burnout from that sport. So there are some recommendations in play that have been proposed. So we would probably recommend that children don't exceed the number of training hours for a given sport than their age in a given week. So if you have a 10-year-old... So you have a guideline? Yeah, so guidelines are in press. So if you had an 11 or 12-year-old, then they shouldn't be participating in any more hours of sport for a single sport than their age. So they shouldn't be doing any more than 11 or 12 hours in a given week. That's easier said than done. Not always adhered to. Gymnastics is a classic example of that, where it's not unreasonable. It's not unheard of for young children to be hitting 25, almost 30 hours of training for gymnastics in a given week.
It's almost like swimming.
And they'll be sort of 12, 13-year-olds. So they're almost 3 times what the recommendation would be. And it's about, I think there's a piece on working with those sports, and probably at three different levels. So the athletes themselves, if the athletes enjoy sport, that's why they get involved in it, to have fun, and I think that's really important that we hold on to. I think there's an education piece with coaches, just in terms of coach education around what the emerging data is showing us. And finally, I think educating in the right way sports parents. So I was part of an EU-funded project. And we actually had representation from Denmark on that team. And we tried to develop resources that could be shared with sports parents that would teach them about, the basics of athletic training, the basics of what it means for, sports talent and sports development, what it means for managing conversations before, during and after, competition. And so that's a worthwhile product. And I think sometimes parents get an unfair rap. The pushy parents, but a lot of parents I just want the best for their children at the end of the day. So it's about working with them to make that process as effective and efficient as we can. But to slam parents is not the way to do it.
No. But I mean, creating a beneficial culture for youth development is something that should start with the place that the kids do the sports, and they should influence the parents first and foremost.
Correct. Yeah, and it's just about how you have those conversations and how you try to educate. We always try to speak directly with the parents, but then we might share with them the top 5 tips, something like that's easily digestible. But some parents will genuinely have interest in some of these topic areas, and through conversations they might actually then want to go and read the more advanced position statements on that given area. But I think it's having different levels of information for different types of parents is important. Yeah.
So you talked about growth velocity. So when the boy starts, and that's one axis of development, I guess. So when the boys start producing more testosterone, that coincides probably with but that of course, that provides for opportunities for increased adaptation, but also for increased stresses and loads during exercise. Correct. Is that something that in itself that you try to deal with?
Yeah. So I guess making reference to the growth spurt and peak height velocity. You would tend to see more sort of skeletal type issues at that stage, and maybe some more sort of tendinous type injuries. But we know from sort of 6 to 18 months after peak height velocity, we have peak weight velocity reaches its peak. So, children are first stretched before they're filled out. And, their body needs to become accustomed to managing the bigger muscle mass, and that potentially could lead to an increased risk of sort of groin type related issues. So it's something that we track alongside the height, and if you're taking those serial measures over time, you're able then to work out what the growth velocities are. But we actually take the data, and we're able to provide an estimate of maturity status. So we would use there's some different options. You have the maturity offset. Back in the day, probably less used now, Tanner staging. But from a somatic perspective, we use the Camus-Roach method, which gives us an indication of where a child sits in terms of their percentage of predicted adult height.
Yeah,
and we know that the peak height, that the adolescent growth spurt will reach its peak somewhere between probably like 87 to 94, 95% of predicted adult height.
Okay.
So if we're tracking that over time, we're able then to sort of say, right, well, this athlete is around 91, 92% of their predicted adult height. We probably just need to keep an extra eye and be a little more vigilant on this athlete in case they report with, some discomfort in terms of some pain, or if they're looking particularly fatigued, if they're not moving with as much coordination. So it's really about that maturation data coming in and helping inform our decision making then in terms of what we prescribe from a training standpoint.
Yeah. But during those months or the year when the boys are getting significantly stronger than the girls and gaining more weight, is that something that is handled in the exercise prescription, where they have less impact exercises and lower peak forces during those times? Or?
So the growth spurt, we may need to strip training dosage back a little.
Just dosage, not on intensity or impact. Or
so it will depend. It's I don't think there's necessarily a one size fits all. What we might do if you take a movement like a squat, as a back squat as an example, it's a commonly used example. If we have a child that's going through that sort of, we think they're at that peak rate of growth, we may not put as much load throughout the whole movement, so we might reduce the range of motion that they're going through under load. But we might then use sort of isometric type exercises to coincide with the program, which forces them to produce maximal amounts of force, but just not through such a dynamic range.
Okay.
Would we then target, if we know the athlete is post-peak height velocity and they're starting to put on additional mass, if the sport required, we may, and the athlete, needed to put on additional mass, that would be a good opportunity to provide some sort of hypertrophy type training to get those increases in muscle size. But it varies, and the children tend to be very receptive to types of training that will really be driving the neuromuscular system, so strength, power and speed type training. And that kind of aligns synergistically with the types of adaptations they're experiencing as a result of growth and maturation, a lot of central nervous system development. But then when we get to adolescence and we're post-peak height velocity, we start seeing, because of the hormonal changes, structural adaptations, increases in size, and that's probably where, as I said, more hypertrophy-based training might be more appropriate for some of those athletes. But importantly, even though we would have that awareness of maturity status, we have to program based on what we see in front of us. So if we have a 16, 17-year-old who's never done any strength and conditioning before, well, they don't just get the same program that someone who's been doing it for 10 years is in receipt of. So we would almost start at the very start with those.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. I don't think I have any more questions.
Bro, okay. Well, thanks very much for the invite, and great to be here.
Where can people follow you and your group's work?
Yeah, so obviously on the Cardiff Met University website, my staff profile will be there, an email address, but I'm not a huge social media sort of person, but at Dr. R.S. Lloyd is my Twitter handle.
Okay.
But I'm on there every now and again, but not a lot. So.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right, thanks very much.
Yes, I've had the opportunity to talk to Karin Silbernagel. It's a pretty big deal in physiotherapy research, and this is Thursday at the conference, and Saturday she'll be having 2 sessions called Physical Training in the Treatment of Tendinopathy, Practical Approach, and Rehabilitation After Muscle Strain Injury, Practical Approach. And those were the headlines that prompted me to write Karin if she could spare 15 minutes for the podcast. So first of all, thank you for lending us a couple of minutes, and could you just briefly introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yes, my name is Karin Silbernagel. I'm a professor at University of Delaware that actually runs the University of Delaware Tendon Research Group. I've been there for, I think, like 8 to 10 years now, but originally from Sweden too. So I've been a transplant back and forth, and tendon research is kind of my main area. So
can you give like a concentrate of what you're going to present at those 2 workshops or symposia?
Well, the purpose kind of is to kind of get down to, we do a lot of research and we have a lot of results coming out, but sometimes when you read that, it's really hard. So now I have my patient in front of me, so what do I actually do? And it's trying to kind of get it down to, so how do you respond to patients? How does education look like? How does exercise? And I want people to start experiencing while you're doing different things, how are they different as well? So trying to get down to more of the, so how do I do that when I get back to my clinic on Monday?
And how does that look in practice if we're talking about patellar tendinopathy or Achilles tendinopathy?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing that our research now is really looking into too is that not all patients are the same, and one size does not fit all. So if that's not the case. You can't do everything with everybody. How do you really figure out what to do with whom? So we work a lot on evaluation and try to evaluate different aspects of tendon health, we call it. So we're looking at structure, we're looking at function, the various functional tests, we're looking at patient-reported outcomes, fear of movement, we do ultrasound imaging. We try to kind of encompass everything and the patient. So first of all, you need to figure out who you have in front of you. Second of all, exercise has the highest level of evidence. So we know that exercise is really important. So we are really getting into some nitty-gritty, like how do we exercise specifically too. But I think also dispel the myth that the first thing you really need to do is just do one exercise, because one exercise is a lot better than nothing to start to get to exercise. So that's like the first step of getting somebody going. And then when you have athletes and move forward, then you might want to get really into like, how do I specifically exercise and how do I move forward with those? So it's not one size fits all. And then athlete has a lot higher demands than maybe somebody that just wanted to go back to hiking and walking. So kind of separate that up. And the last part that we are, well, not the last part, we can talk forever, but one of the things that I'm really excited about now that we're thinking about, because in order to exercise to work, we're looking at structure, we're talking about strain. So we want the tendon to be pulled apart to actually strain it, and that seems to be what stimulates recovery of a tendon. So for example, in healthy tendons, it's been shown that if you do heavier load under longer time, seems to be much better than shorter time, lower loads, because heavier load actually stretches out the tendon a bit more. But the other thing that we're looking at now in our research lab is that just because you do an exercise doesn't mean you're straining the tendon as much as you think. We could actually see for squatting, like the Spanish squat, when you squat down and sit kind of like in a 90-90 position, that's been used a lot for patella tendinopathy. If we add muscle stim on top of that, we can actually see an increase in strain by 50%. So just because you're doing an exercise doesn't mean you get as much strain as you think. And if you then have people with tendinopathies that have pain, maybe they can do the exercise, but they're actually not loading the tendon the way you think. So that could be another variable why we're not getting the same.
So to get that straight, you're talking about like a regular partial squat where you're putting electrical stimulation on the quadriceps on top of the normal squat movement. Is that imposed continually or dynamically with the movement?
Yeah, so this is more of a, not a hypothetical, but a lot of people do with a strap behind the tibia, so you can actually lean back and sit in a 90-90. They do that in Spain, the track and field. And if you sit in that position, we can actually measure the length of the patella tendon with ultrasound. And then if we superimpose that with NMES, electrical stimulation, on top of it to add electrical stimulation, we can see that we actually increase the strain. So the tendon is stretched out even further.
So you call that a Spanish squat? I think in Denmark, those devices are known as sissy squat benches or sissy squat racks. Is that the same in the States?
Yeah, we call them Spanish squat, and it comes from Angel Bazas in Spain. He did his PhD with Australia, with Jill Cook and things too, so they started calling it the Spanish squat. He doesn't call it the Spanish squat, but we call it the Spanish squat. But it's an example of looking at, just because you're doing an exercise, you might not get as much load onto the tendon as you think, because we are very good at compensating, which is a good sign for the human person, right? We want to compensate. But if you think you're going to get strengthening to the tendon, maybe it does not happen.
So in multi-joint movements, people can have compensatory patterns that load different muscles than you would normally assume to be responsible for the movement. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly what I'm saying. And it's not only in, multi-joint movements is one thing, right? The other thing that we're doing a lot in Delaware for people with, for example, ACL injuries is looking at quadriceps activation ratio. And that is when you are pushing as hard as you can. You're sitting stuck, you're doing isometric knee extension exercise, and you can see your max force. And we're assuming that's your max output. If you're superimpose electrical stimulation on top of that, you should not get higher output if you're using all your muscles. But if you get a higher output, that difference is the quadriceps activation ratio. That's a deficit that you're not recruiting. And we see that in injuries and pain too. So that's another thing that maybe some people are not responding the same for certain exercise program that other does.
So if I can reel back a little bit, you talked about like grading patients, or so is that like for research purposes, or is that actually part of like the clinical practice with tendinopathy patients?
Yeah, so we are definitely looking at, so my biggest thing is, I got a little nerdy there before, didn't I? Okay, but anyway, talking about, so we're looking at the patients too. We've seen subgroups of patients. So if somebody comes in with, for example, Achilles tendinopathy, it assumed to be an overuse injury in runners, and we were treating everybody like that. But then sometimes you have somebody coming in at 60 years old, they have a lot of pain, their tendon might look horrible, and they look very, very different. So we use data to use all these various outcomes to try to understand where their deficits are and how do we address those to kind of get much more of a precision or individual's rehabilitation. And we've seen that there actually are subgroups of people that might respond differently to the exercises.
So can you describe these? So if I'm understanding what you're saying, you're like describing different tendinopathy phenotypes. Can you describe what they look like, the different ones, if that makes any sense?
It makes perfect sense, and too bad people can't see my hands. But
a lot of hand waving going on.
So, but basically what we see is we call it, so we have subgroups now. We just published in JUSPT looking over time. But basically what we saw, we put in all this data that we have, and what we see is that we have, for example, one activity dominant group, which are the younger, athletic. They don't have a lot of structural change. They don't have that much symptoms. They don't have a lot of deficits, for example, in heel rise and those things too, but they have problems being as active as they want to be.
So they don't have swelling, but just pain, or?
So they still have some structural change, but doesn't look like a big change in the tendon. Versus maybe we have one group that is we call structure dominant. Their tendons are like 3 times as thick, maybe as the other side. They're usually obese, overweight men. They don't have that much symptoms. They have deficits in function, but they look a little different. And another group is, for example, what we call psychosocial dominant. They have a high fear of movement. They have functional deficits. Tendon doesn't look that bad. And so there are different groups that then you might want to treat differently, addressing fear of movement, addressing structural change, which might be related to metabolic syndrome, to try to put this picture together.
I'm just trying to find out how to phrase this question. So how would this phenotype influence what kind of exercise or glucocorticoid or whatever prescription should be given?
I think the biggest thing is what we see with our exercise program, that everybody can get better. We use a lot of the pain monitoring models, so we are allowing people to have pain when they exercise, but we use that to describe it, which seems to help the people with kinesiophobia. So instead of them not improving as well, with our education and the exercises, the kinesiophobia actually goes down within 8 weeks of the exercises. So the education piece might be very important for those that are fearful of loading, even though we should load. Then we have those people with the really thick, heavy tendons. That tendon might never go back to normal, so that might not be the expectation, but they still get better with exercise. So you can looking at more of the expectations for what they need to do. So their focus should not be, did my tendon thickness change? The other part is too, when you might thinking about what the progression is, right? The activity dominant with small symptoms and things is probably the athlete that you give exercise, you'd give some load control, don't run every day, we're going to look at the recovery. They might be off and good within 8 weeks versus the other ones. You might expect it to take 16 weeks, 24 weeks, and up to a year to recover fully.
So I have a question that is a little more in basic science. Maybe it's too basic, I don't know. But when the tendon experiences load, is it known now if, like, what is the dose response relationship of the experienced strain in the tendon? Does it matter if it's isometric or cyclic, and when is is it known when it is saturated?
I think you should ask a lot of your previous advisor maybe on that, but a lot of people have done the research. In general, what we know from the clinical perspective is that what the muscle does, concentrically, eccentric, isometric, the tendon does not know. The tendon doesn't care. The tendon just cares the amount of load. So how much you stretch it out and for how long you stretch it out. And it seems to be that stretch it out more, so higher strain, for a little bit longer period of time might generate more changes within the tendon than faster, lower load activity. So if you're looking at tendon changing to become stronger, tendon remodeling, that might be the key aspects that you need to look at. But that could be a difference when you're looking also at return to sport. You still might want to load other ways, right, to get it better.
So I know that Keith Barr has been here a number of times, and he's been talking about supplementing with collagen supplements and vitamin C in treatment of tendinopathy. I know that he may be a little premature on some of that, but what is your stand of that in the rehabilitation of tendinopathy?
I think that where we're looking at, the metabolism for the tendon is fairly slow, right? So if you're eating a meal today or tomorrow, how quickly can that actually be incorporated into? So it's a little bit hard for me to say you're going to eat this and then it's going to get to the tendon. That's really slow remodeling, right? It might just be eat well and don't, do stupid things. But I think there's probably something there. And what we're really interesting now is we're looking at people with metabolic syndrome, people that have high cholesterol, higher blood sugar levels, those things. They are high risk. We showed it here in Denmark study, higher risk for developing tendinopathies. And what we see when we classify our patients either at metabolic syndrome or not, we see the people with non-metabolic syndrome respond the tendon really well over time with exercise program. Metabolic syndrome doesn't seem to be. So maybe they have a higher turnover in a shitty environment. So maybe then the tendon doesn't respond. So probably environment, nutrition matters, but how much what we are intake to get directly into a tendon and slow metabolism, I have a little harder time to see where that goes.
Another question, and if it's besides your area, just skip it, but how about, I know that estrogen is important for the muscle, for training tolerance, and I know that influences the tendons in a number of ways as well, and I do believe that menopause is associated with an increased prevalence of tendinopathy. How can that be factored into the rehabilitation? Is that something... there's very little papers on it as far as I can tell, so I'd just like to hear thoughts on that.
I got excited about this one. Okay, so we just finished, we have a 5-year NIH-funded study comparing men and women with the current exercise program. So we just finished that, and we're just going to start analyzing, just comparing men and women. The negative part about this study is we did not check hormonal levels, so we just have age and all the other variables that we have. But I think that's the first study to really see how men and women respond. The other thing we've done is just to look at healthy women, looking at tendon properties, and we can see certain properties is not any difference with age, neither in men and women, but some properties have actually, we can see a decline in women but not in men, which is what we call shear modulus from elastography. So I think there's definitely, maybe that decline is just around menopause. Incidentally, what would work with patients, what is really interesting is I make my patient put in training diaries if I work with people, and they put in the exercises and pain levels, but I also have the women athlete put in the menstrual cycle. And there are interesting data from them saying that, well, now when they started doing that, when they have increased pain, they get less worried because it seems to have a heightened increased pain maybe the week before they get a period and things too. So we're starting to go so I think it really, really matters. I think it's the hardest part I've been avoiding doing that research because it's really hard, because if you're going to do it and people have done it, they should come down and you should have blood draws, I think like every 2 weeks to know where they are in their cycle and how that is affected and things too. I think in the future studies, we're really going to start looking more into the age range of the menopause to kind of see the changes too. But I was avoiding that in that study because it's a lot of work and it's really hard to kind of design it.
Final question, I think. So if you have a patella or Achilles tendinopathy or plantar fasciitis or whatever it is, if you go to the doctor today, are you actually going to have a better time, do better than if you did so 25 years ago?
I think it depends on the doctor. If you go to the physical therapist today, I think maybe. I mean, I think it really matters. I think we all are in that movement and activity matters. So I think as long as we load, we're getting a lot better. But to tell you one of the stories from the United States, and that might be in the United States, but one of my patients came in with two bilateral ankle foot orthoses. So plastic almost boob, but orthosis, because she had Achilles tendinopathy and she was really hurting, and her doctor said she needed AFOs, which is what you use for stroke patients. They can't even plantar flex or keep the foot up. And that's what she was walking down. You can imagine how her quality of life had changed. From pain. And they thought that was the best. She should offload it and she should not have any load to it. Luckily, they didn't put her in a wheelchair. And we started with our exercise program, and she's back to running and happy, but it took about 6 months to a year. And the hardest part about that rehab was to get her to understand that the doctor was an idiot and should have never put her in there, right? I can say that the doctor is in the U.S., but apparently the doctor had the door next door to her office was the people that was doing orthotics and all those kind of things too. So maybe that was a financial. You can never put this in the United States. Anyway, but I mean that's. So yes, I think you should get better, but I mean there's still crazy stuff going on out there.
Okay, I have a second half of the final question. So, if you go to the doctor with a tendinopathy in 25 years, do you think people are going to do significantly better then, or have you hit the apex of tendinopathy rehabilitation?
Great question, and I told you I would keep on talking. But I think I'm hoping that at some point, I think there should be biologics. I mean, I think there might be. Could somebody find whatever? Can we have any kind of injection or anything to kind of support the area to get the recovery from the exercise? I don't think you can ever get away from exercise, but I do think there are ways so we can get the environment where the tendon is going to respond to get that better. So I'm hoping that will be some kind of difference. And, sometimes there are, medical advances that do huge changes. But my biggest thing is I hope what I'm pushing for in 25 years or maybe 10 years is that I think tendinopathy is not an injury, but it's more of a biological disease. And we should look at it like we do osteoarthritis or knee osteoarthritis. And I'm really pushing for that too, because that would help increase the funding in this area. But I do think we should think about it much broader, and that would help our patients, I think.
Thank you. That's an excellent answer. I don't have any more questions, but could you just, and thank you for lending us 20 minutes of your time. Could you just, if you're on Twitter or ResearchGate or whatever, can you just, if you want people to know what you're doing, just tell them your full name and where they can follow you.
Yeah, so my full name is Karin Silbernagel, but I go by KG Silbernagel on Twitter, and that's how you can find me. I'm at University of Delaware, so if you just get to University of Delaware, you could easily find me in the physical therapy department there too. And I want to leave everybody with one message too. Instead of getting worried about how specific you should exercise, just make sure they start loading. Find one way to do it and have them move forward with it, and it's going to take time.
Thank you very much. Jamen, jeg har fået lov til at fange Morten Høgh, som er Mr. Pain her i Danmark i hvert fald, som er aktiv i flere sessions her på Sportskongres. Og allerførst, du måske lige præsentere dig selv med fulde navn og affiliering og TikTok-profiler, hvad ved jeg?
Jeg er ikke lige noget på TikTok endnu, men det kan være, fordi jeg er så gammel. Men det er rigtigt, jeg hedder Morten Høgh, og jeg er oprindeligt uddannet fysioterapeut og har været kliniker. Jeg har været på klinik og et meget, meget kort på hospital også i mange år. Jeg er stadigvæk patienter, men siden 2010 har jeg været gående mere og mere over mod det akademiske, og først taget en Master of Science i smertevidenskab, og så har jeg bagefter lavet en en Ph.D. i Neuroscience, også med fokus på smerte. Og i dag er jeg så lektor på Aalborg Universitet, hvor jeg er koblet op på den forskningsenhed, der hedder Musculoskeletal Health and Implementation, og undervisningsmæssigt er jeg koblet op på kandidaten i muskuloskeletal fysioterapi på Aalborg Universitet. Ja. Det gør jeg på deltid, og resten af tiden, der laver jeg forskellige tiltag. Blandt andet har jeg en kort podcast-serie på 6 afsnit, der hedder Smertevejleder podcast, og jeg har skrevet lidt forskellige bøger og bogkapitler, og så laver jeg selvfølgelig noget forskning i min fritid også. Ja. Udover det, jeg laver på universitetet. Ja.
Fedt. Hvad hedder det? Så nu, de sessions, du er involveret i her på kongressen, de hedder The Role of Neuroscience in Sports Medicine to Understand Pain in Athletes, og A Closer Look at the Shoulder Tissue Pathology of Pain, og How Clinicians Can Utilize the Neuroscience Model in Their Clinical Practice. Så man aner jo sådan et gennemgående tema. Så hvad betyder det, når du siger neuroscience i den her sammenhæng?
sådan helt ærligt, så neuroscience her, det er mere sådan en eye-catcher.
Ja, okay. Jeg tænkte, det var lidt det, jeg var ude efter.
det er neuroscience er jo dybest set noget andet, ikke? Men det, der er den gennemgående røde tråd i det er jo, at som kliniker har jeg, og det er du også selv, og mange andre har stået den her følelse af, at vi gør det, vi synes er det rigtige, og så bliver patienten ikke tilsvarende bedre. Ja. Og det er jo lige meget, om det er styrketræning, vi har lavet, eller det har været hvad som helst, så er der jo et eller andet, der ikke virker sådan, som teorien siger, det skulle. Ja. Og der synes jeg, at hele den her vej, jeg har taget igennem forståelsen, hvor det har været smerten, og i starten så var det jo meget kroniske smerter, og det er det også stadigvæk, det synes jeg er voldsomt interessant, og hvad det gør ved mennesker og sådan noget. Men der er mere og mere af det, der også begynder at resonere rigtig godt over i de helt almindelige patienter i gåseøjne. Så især idrætten.
Altså fra sport til
ja, så fra neuroscience, og så den kroniske patient, og alt det, vi lærte om dem, og hvor vi troede, vi kunne forstå smerterne, det har så vist sig, det kan vi ikke nu i hvert fald. Men alt den viden, vi har derfra, den begynder at translatere utrolig fint over i neuroscience, hvor mange af de helt basale ting, vi har lært omkring, hvordan nervesystemet reagerer, for eksempel på vævsskader og på belastning og sådan noget, de kan give nogle fortællinger omkring det, der sker i klinikken, som kan lede til direkte handlinger. Så jeg giver et eksempel. Når nogen kommer ind og har ondt, så kunne vi finde på at sige, lad os sige, at de havde bevæget armen rigtig meget og havde fået den diagnose, der måske hedder subakumale smerter, eller de har ondt i skulderen, uspecifik skuldersmerter, et eller andet. Så vil vi først finde ud af, hvad de ikke fejler. Så der er ikke cancer, der er ikke fraktur, der er ikke ruptur og sådan noget. Og så er de jo stadigvæk ondt. Men det har ikke fortalt os, hvad vi skal gøre ved dem. Og der er mange af de diagnoser, vi giver i dag, de er ramt ind under det term, der hedder diagnostic uncertainty, som jo egentlig bare betyder, at vi ved ikke helt, hvad det betyder. Og det, der er det store problem i det, som jeg ser det, det er, at vi ikke ved, hvad konsekvensen er, så der er ikke nogen direkte handlinger. Så nu siger jeg til en patient, du har skuldersmerter.
Altså er det en destination, man kan få ind i sundhedsplatformen?
Ja, det kunne du sige. Altså supracranial impingement er
noget... Altså det der med usikker diagnose, er det man kan ende med?
Det vil det faktisk kunne godt gå hen og blive. Altså det egentlig betyder, så hvis vi tager teknologien bag det er jo bare, at vi siger, eller teknikken bag det er, at vi siger, at her er der nogle tilstande, hvor diagnoserne kan være mangfoldige. Altså den samme patient kan faktisk få forskellige diagnoser, og det er jo det, vi kan begynde at se. Ja. Og det, der er så interessant, det er jo, at hver giver en diagnose, der passer ind i deres terminologi. Så kirurgen vil sige, at det her det er noget, der har med afklemning at gøre. Fysen vil sige, det er fordi, du er for svag, og rheumatologen vil sige, der er nok noget inflammation og sådan noget. Ikke?
Yes,
og de har alle sammen lidt ret.
For et søm ligner alting en hammer.
Ja, præcis. Ikke?
Eller for en hammer ligner alting en søm, det var sådan,
ja, eller omvendt. Men i hvert fald, så bliver det meget den der med, at fordi du har den diagnose, skal du have den her behandling. Og det, som der så er mere og mere, der peger på, det er, at når det kommer til sportsmedicin, så er vi virkelig gode til at se sømmene, fordi vi netop har en hammer i lommen. Og det, som vi forsøger med de 3 sessioner her, det har været at sige, når vi nu går i stå med nogle af de her patienter, er der så ikke noget andet grundforskning, som kunne hjælpe os videre, og kan give os et nyt syn på de her mennesker? Så min case var før, at du kunne godt komme ind og have en overuse-problematik, eller en overbelastningsskade i skulderen. Og hvis den er det, hvis det er kommet på grund af overbelastning, så det vi ved om kroppen, det er, at den vil jo finde et homeostatisk niveau igen. Så hvis du lader være at provokere det, så skal den egentlig falde tilbage. Det kan vi forklare på molekylært niveau, hvordan sker det, og hvorfor gør det ondt og sådan noget. Så der har neuroscience nogle fede forklaringsmodeller. Men det vi også ved, det er, hvis det så ikke er tilfældet, at det bare går væk, når du venter. Og det er jo faktisk det typisk kliniske billede. Ja. Så har vi faktisk også nogle modeller, der er bedre, end at du får slap, eller du klemmer det af, eller der er noget fibrose. Så der ved vi, der kan ske nogle forandringer i nervesystemet. De kan ikke forklare det hele, og de er heller ikke handlingsparate lige nu. Men de begynder at hjælpe os til at forstå, at den smerte, atleten så har i skulderen, den kan vi faktisk påvirke på en anden måde. Så først og fremmest, du behøver ikke blive stærkere, eller du behøver ikke kunne alt muligt andet. Hvis du kan spille badminton med den smerte, og vi kan kontrollere smerten, så er der ikke noget farligt i det. Ja. Og det var sådan et af budskaberne i går fra den session, vi kørte omkring neuroscience og atleten der, det er at sige, at smerter er egentlig ikke en progressiv sygdom. Så der kan være mange, der har ondt i en sene eller et led i 6 måneder, hvor de er clearet på blodprøver og på røntgen og klinisk, så vi kan ikke finde ud af, hvad der er galt med dem, vil vi typisk sige. Men det, de egentlig har, det er en smerte, der hæmmer dem i det, de gerne vil. Ja. Og der er hypotesen, så kan vi vide, om ikke vi kunne behandle de mennesker på en anden måde, så de faktisk kunne gøre mere af det, de gerne vil, hvis vi bare hjalp dem til at kunne håndtere og have kompetencerne til at kunne styre de her smerter. Ja.
Og den, kan du sige lidt mere om det, hvad den behandling så består i, når det ligesom ikke er det konventionelle? Eller?
Ja, det er et godt spørgsmål, fordi det er jo lige nok det der, hvor det faktisk ændrer sig. Det er jo, at så neuroscience tager det udtryk igen. Det er jo måden, vi studerer dybest set, hvordan nervesystemet eller kroppen hænger sammen med bevidstheden, ikke? Så smerte er noget, vi oplever, og det, der sker i kroppen, det er noget, vi kan måle og veje, og det vil typisk være nociceptionen, vi kigger på der. Men det kunne også være immunforsvaret, eller det kunne være andre dele af kroppen. Det vi så kan se, det er, at det kan vi faktisk manipulere med på forskellige måder. Og den mest sådan udbredte måde at forske det her på, det er jo ved at kigge på placeboeffekter og noceboeffekter. Ja. Altså de her såkaldte uspecifikke effekter. Der kan vi måle, at der sker noget i kroppen hos de her mennesker, der oplever en placeboeffekt og sådan noget. Og der var der mange, der i starten troede, at placebo det var ufint, eller det var snyd, eller det var bedrag patienten, eller sådan noget. Det viser sig, at meget af det, vi gør der, det kan noget. Og derfor er der mange, der forsker i det. Og det viser sig, det er for eksempel forventninger. De leder til de her positive effekter. Altså positive forventninger leder oftere til positive effekter.
Og vice versa.
Og vice versa. Så negative forventninger leder til negative effekter. Ja. Og det vil sige, når man nu har den her patient med ondt i skulderen, så kan det godt være, at det er vigtigere, hvad patienten synes og føler og gerne vil. Og derfor begynder det pludseligt. Så der, hvor det klinisk ændrer sig, det er jo, at patientens forståelse for sit eget problem, deres fortælling om deres eget problem, og de konsekvenser, det har for dem at have det her problem, de begynder at spille en rolle. Så det kunne være, at jeg siger til dem, hvorfor har du ondt i skulderen? Så det ved du bedre end mig, siger de. Så siger de, jeg ved måske noget om skulderen, og jeg ved noget om smerter og sådan noget, men kan du ikke prøve at fortælle mig, nu har du haft det i 6 måneder. Den erfaring, hvad har den lært dig? Og så kan de måske fortælle mig, at det her, det gør rigtig ondt, og når jeg gør det, så det undrer mig faktisk, fordi der gør det slet ikke ondt, og når det gør rigtig ondt, så kan jeg gøre det her, så bliver det bedre. Så de fortæller mig en hel masse ting, som jeg så kan putte ind i min forforståelse. Og sige, at det lyder egentlig som om, at du godt kan være aktiv, men at det koster noget, så det gør ondt, når du har været aktiv. Er det også sådan, du oplever det? Jamen, det er rigtigt. Så siger, hvorfor er du så ikke bare aktiv? Det kunne være sådan et lidt naivt spørgsmål, som jeg synes er meget interessant. Og så siger de, jamen, det kan jeg jo ikke, for så slider jeg jo på min scene, og hvis jeg bliver ved med det, så går den i stykker. Ja. Og det kan jo være, at det er rigtigt, det kan også være, det er forkert. Og sandsynligheden er, at hvis du degenererer i din scene, så vil den gå over på et tidspunkt, men det er ikke sikkert, at det er noget med din idræt at gøre. Så kan vi have en dialog omkring det. Og det skulle så gerne ende med, at atleten får en forståelse for, at de her smerter, de er det, de er, altså de smerterne, og de er hæmmende, og de kan være invaliderende. Men det er ikke fordi, der er noget, der er spændt, eller stramt, eller slapt, eller gået over. Fordi det kan vi jo faktisk undersøge os ud af. Ja. Så ved at udelukke de ting, så må det jo være noget andet, ikke? Og der viser det sig, at når vi hjælper patienter eller mennesker til at få en anden forståelse for, hvad konsekvensen af deres smerter er, så er der også flere, der ændrer adfærd. Og det kunne så netop være eliteatleten, der ved, at de får ondt, når de laver en bestemt ting, men den ting gør de, lad os sige, i 3 kampe ud af 20.
Og så kan man æde den. Ja,
og så ved de, det koster 2 dage, når de har fået det der ja, eller lad os sige et eller andet i knæet eller lysken, hvad det nu er. Men det er da bedre, end at være ude alle 20 kampe.
Ja.
Og det vi så skal kunne stå på mål for, og det er der, hvor jeg mener, vi er vældig kompetente, det er jo til at sige, det er ikke farligt. Du fejler ikke noget, der er ikke noget, der går i stykker, du er ikke ved at slide dig selv ihjel. Alle de der ting, det kræver selvfølgelig, at vi følger lidt med på, hvad ved vi, og hvad siger forskningen, og hvad er risikofaktorerne og sådan noget. Men det er, altså igen her er det jo et godt eksempel, der er masser af mennesker, der ved noget om det. Så det er jo egentlig bare at supplere den viden med nogle handlinger. Det er dybest set det, vi forsøger at gøre med den her tilgang.
Der er jo sådan den her bevægelse og biopsykosociale smertemodel, altså det er jo noget, der har, det er min oplevelse, at det er noget, der har flyttet sig mere i Danmark, end mange af de omkringliggende lande, sådan over det sidste årti. Og det udgør jo også sådan lidt et paradigmeskift i behandlingen af muskel- og skeletproblematikker. Og det gør jo, at der kommer sådan et fagkulturelt lag ovenpå det, hvor man dels har en masse efteruddannelse til fysioterapeuter, der er forankret i nogle bestemte skoler, som har meget, meget sådan biomekanisk forankrede modeller. Og hvor at de her biomekanisk forankrede modeller, de jo hænger fast i sådan noget pyramidespil, sådan noget, hvor der er nogen, der tjener en masse penge på at holde nogle kurser. Der er nogen, der betaler en masse penge for at deltage i de her kurser, så man kan få de rigtige diplomer til at hænge op på væggen i sin klinik. Og det er sådan rent epistemisk, så er det sådan lidt uheldigt miljø, fordi hvis man betaler 20.000 for et kursus, så er man nok ikke så tilbøjelig til at stikke en finger i vejret og sige, er du helt sikker på, at det passer det der? Og hvis man tjener 1,5 million om året på at holde de der kurser, så må jeg heller ikke helt så tilbøjelig til at sadle lidt om og sige, sådan er det måske ikke helt i virkeligheden. Altså, kan du sige lidt om din oplevelse af det der skisme, ligesom der er?
da du var på 24/7, havde vi lidt den samme snak.
Ja. Men det er jo stadigvæk pågående, ved jeg. Altså,
ja, men det er jeg vil godt, eller jeg tror, du har ret. Jeg tror bare ikke, at det gælder alle, og jeg bliver selvfølgelig også selv ramt. Jeg holder også kurser og tjener også penge på dem. Det er en del af mit job, altså udover den halvtidsansættelse, jeg har. Så jeg vil jo påstå, at det ikke altid er tilfældet.
Nej, det er heller ikke sådan. Altså, det er ikke...
Men jeg anerkender, at der kan godt være
nogle incentiver, der skubber... Altså,
så hvis vi nu siger noget andet, så man siger, nu har jeg ikke... Jeg tjener ikke penge på behandlinger, så der har jeg ikke noget at gøre. Men jeg tror stadigvæk heller ikke, at folk, uanset om de får en månedlig løn, eller de får en løn per patient, så tror jeg ikke, de gør det for pengenes skyld. Men jeg tror, du har ret i, at der kan godt være et incitament i, at man ikke vil lave noget om, der allerede fungerer. Det, der er problemet, og som du peger på, hvor jeg er enig, det er, at det, der fungerer, det er, at det er en indtægtskilde. Og det var ikke det skulle være. Det skulle jo være en vej til videreudvikling. Så fokus skal hele tiden være på videreudvikling. Og det var faktisk en af grundene til, at jeg fik repræsentantskabet Dansk Fysioterapeuter til at tage stilling til, om ikke alle kurser, der bliver fremhævet under Danske Fysioterapeuter og Dansk Selskab for Fysioterapi, de burde have en varedeklaration. Ja. Jeg synes som minimum, at man skal vide, hvad man køber. Ja. Så kan folk tage stilling til, om de vil købe kurset til 30.000 kroner, fordi det er jo op til dem sådan set. Jo. Men som minimum skal de vide, hvad er kompetencen. Så hvis der var en, der holdt et smertekursus, det var mig, så synes jeg jo, det mindste, man kunne gøre som kursist, det må være lynhurtigt at kunne få overblik over, ved den person noget om det, som jeg gerne vil have. Hvor har de deres viden fra? Er det holdninger? Er det gode fortællinger? Er det egne erfaringer? Er det evidens? Er det en blanding af det hele? Så det ikke kun bliver de der, hvor man rater forskellige butikker ind på nettet. Trustpilot, ikke? Altså, det bliver lidt det, så dem der får god Trustpilot-vurdering på Twitter, det er dem, der sælger billetter, ikke? Og det synes jeg er ærgerligt, fordi jeg synes jo, det er videreudvikling, vi gerne vil. Og der tror jeg nogle gange, at det kan være befriende, det er sådan, at jeg oplevede i hvert fald, det er befriende at kunne gøre det, jeg tror på er rigtigt, i stedet for at være underlagt en eller anden form for ramme. Så lige nu, hvor jeg underviser meget på Aalborg Universitet på den her muskuloskeletale kandidatuddannelse, der synes jeg jo, det er fantastisk, fordi mine interesser og evidensen og Aalborg Universitets interesser, de er alignet. Ja. Men hvis jeg nu blev sat i en situation, hvor de bad mig om at undervise i noget andet, noget jeg ikke var kompetent til for eksempel, eller at de begyndte at have en anden holdning til det, så vil jeg jo tænke, det strider imod det, og så synes jeg, det var fedt, jeg har muligheden for at gå ud og gøre det selv. Ja, så der er nok for liberalistisk til at tro, at vi ikke skal gøre det. Men jeg synes, det er vigtigt, at vi deklarerer, hvad det er, vi gør. Og jeg mener, at du har ret i, at der er nok nogen, hvor man kunne mistænke i hvert fald, at incitamentet er...
Men incitamenterne er der, men spørgsmålet er, om folk agerer på dem, eller...
Ja, ikke også?
Ja. Men altså... Ja, fordi der er jo sådan nogle dinosaurer derude, ikke? Ligesom der er nogen, der er progressive, og det er jo sådan, har verden altid været, og sådan bliver det nok ved med at være. Men det her, altså man har hvis man er i den situation, man har en scene, hvor der sker noget i, og der kommer et signal op, og det kommer gennem en eller anden højere ordens processering, der kan gøre, at det bliver fortolket som ingenting, eller det kan blive fortolket som noget, der er af. Og det, altså, det her ligesom med, at der kommer et signal ud, som kan give ophav til noget, der bliver oplevet som smerte. Og samtidig med, så har vi lidt det her lag af signalprocessering, ikke? Og vi ved, vi nu altså i nogle afgrænsede problematikker, der ved vi, at for en patellascene er der nogle bestemte ting, vi kan gøre, som virker. Om det så er igennem, fordi det påvirker processeringen, eller fordi det påvirker signalet fra scenen, det er så en anden diskussion, ikke? Men når man så er patienter, bør man i virkeligheden både... Altså, man kan godt pege på nogle risikofaktorer i folks processering. Der er nogle socioøkonomiske forhold, søvn, smertefortællinger og alt sådan noget. Altså, burde man i virkeligheden have en form for stratificering på psykosociale risikofaktorer, ligesom man i noget omfang har på, hvad kan man sige, objektive forhold omkring en dum scene, eller sådan, altså.
Det synes jeg er et virkelig godt spørgsmål, fordi det rammer ned i det, jeg tror, der faktisk er kernen i det her, og det er den måde, vi er alle sammen lært op i den her model, som bedst beskrives som stimulus-respons. Ja. Så du har ondt fordi, så det vil typisk være det, jeg vil kalde det, ikke? Så hver gang, at jeg sidder som kliniker og tænker, hvorfor har du ondt, ikke? Eller du har ondt fordi, så er det fordi, jeg ender med at behandle. Så du har ondt fordi, du har spændte muskler, så er det spændte muskler, der bliver fokus for min behandling. Ja. Der er mange, der tror, at den biopsykosociale model, den er, du har ondt fordi, og så giver man enten en bio, eller en psyko, eller en social, eller alle 3 forklaringer. Og det er faktisk slet ikke det, Georg Engel sagde.
Man kan lige dreje på alle de knapper, der findes.
Ja, det han i virkeligheden sagde, det var, at når du har ondt, så har du ondt, punktum.
Ja.
Men vi kan forstå det ondt, du har på forskellige vinkler. Og det betyder, at vi kan angribe det fra forskellige vinkler også. Men det er ikke årsager, det er ikke reduktionistiske årsager, altså enkeltstående årsager.
Nej.
Det er et meget komplekst netværk af det, han kaldte en hierarkisk systematisk tilgang til det, ikke? Som han havde fra datalogien på det tidspunkt. Hvor mange faktorer gør sådan en effekt, eller der kommer noget ud af det. Og det her smerte, det er meget kompliceret, så der kan være mange ting, vi kan gøre for at forstå den. Og for nogen, der vil det være det, den påvirker dem i. Altså lad os sige, der er en, der ikke kan spille deres idræt. Og det er det, den gør for dem. Så kunne man godt sige, at målet er, at de kan spille det. Men det betyder ikke, at det er nemt at gå til. Det kan sagtens være, at det stadigvæk er kompliceret. Nu har vi er bare blevet enige om, at det gør ved dig, det er, at du ikke kan spille.
Ja.
Og så kan behandlingen jo i princippet være, hvad tror du, det skyldes? Eller behandlingen kan være en pille, eller behandlingen kan være noget andet. Så vi identificerer ikke en årsag, som vi behandler, og så bliver du rask. Og det er også det, du siger, det er jo, at det virker lidt som om, at kan man så gøre noget ved den der scene, når vi forstår processen. Og der tror jeg, eller mit svar er, jeg tror, videnskaben, den vej, jeg læser den, peger i retning af, at det kan vi ikke.
Nej.
Vi bliver ikke bedre biomekanikere af at forstå neuroscience. Jeg tror bare, at neuroscience har en model, der åbner op for, at det ikke kun er det perifære stimulus, der medfører smerten, men at det er den nemmeste model at forstå. Ja. Og så sker der bare rigtig meget også, ikke? Hvor øjnene og ørerne og næsene også feeder ind til thalamus og videre ud til hjernen, og så ender det med, at det her menneske oplever smerter. Og det vil sige, at det kan godt være så komplekst, at i stedet for, at vi skal lede efter brikkerne i puslespillet, så skal vi måske sige, at jeg kan se, at der er nogle huller i det her puslespil, men hvad viser det samlede billede? Og det kunne netop være atleten, der siger, men vi ved, hvad det ikke er. Ikke? Så vi er trygge. Jeg som fagperson er tryg ved, at det ikke er farligt. Og det næste skridt er, hvad skal der til, før du lykkes?
Ja.
Og så vil jeg sige, at jeg skal nå grænsen for at komme til OL. Og det kan godt være, at de ikke når det. Smerte er jo invaliderende for nogle mennesker. Der er nogen, der bare ikke kan det, de ville kunne, hvis de ikke havde ondt.
Ja.
Og det vi har lært fra opioidkrisen i USA, det er at gå ensidigt efter at reducere vaskskalaen. Det er en rigtig dum idé.
Ja.
Og det er sådan set lige meget, hvad vi gør det med. Opioidkrisen er bare sådan, nej, fentanyl er ikke et super godt præparat lige til det, anden til at blive narkoman af. Og så kan vi jo se mere og mere kritisk forskning, som også viser, at effekterne er der heller ikke. Så meget af den historie, vi har gået og fortalt hinanden, jamen, altså den historie, vi typisk hører i idrætten også, det er jo, nu har vi prøvet alt det andet, så bliver vi nødt til at prøve kirurgi eller invasiv behandling af en eller anden slags. Ja. Og det tror jeg ikke er måden at gøre det på. Jeg tror, man skal sige, jamen det vi mener, der kunne være det rigtige for dig, det kunne være kirurgi, og så starte med det. Eller selvom vi ikke kan noget, så er det ikke sikkert, at kirurgi kan tilbyde noget oven i alt det andet. Nej. Så på en eller anden måde prøve at være begrænset. Ja, fuldstændig også. Grad, ikke? Så jeg abonnerer meget på det der med at sige, men er det bedste tilbud nogle gange til atleten, at vi siger, nu er vi sådan set færdige med alt andet end at støtte dig. Så at støtte dem og hjælpe dem, sådan som en dygtig coach jo har gjort altid, eller en personlig træner altid har gjort, hjælpe dem med at komme videre. Det tror jeg faktisk er et meget, meget bedre bud på, hvordan vi kan hjælpe de her mennesker, men de skal gøre det. Og så kan jeg godt forstå, hvis der er atleter derude, det ved vi, der er, hvor smerten går hen og bliver så stor en barriere for at være den atlet, de gerne vil være, at de må opgive en drøm. Og der er atleter jo ikke unikke, altså det er der masser af mennesker, der oplever. Og så er vi over i det, jeg kalder kroniske smerter før, ikke? Fordi det er jo det, vi kan se, der er på samfundsniveau, er et kæmpestort problem. Ja. Og der ligger jo et potentiale i at lære at forstå dem, og det gør vi jo i alt, hvad vi kan ude på de kroniske smerter, og jeg er helt sikker på, at jo bedre vi bliver til at forstå dem, jo bedre vil vi så også kunne hjælpe vores atleter. Ja. Og den åbenlyse, hvis jeg lige kommer med et eksempel, som vi er blevet klogere på, det er værdien i at kunne validere. Altså, når du kommer ind som atlet og siger, at jeg har ondt i det her, så forventer mange en såkaldt diagnose. Men det de i virkeligheden, altså det er det, vi tror, de forventer. Det de i virkeligheden efterspørger, det er en forklaring. Og den forklaring skal rime på noget, der føles rigtigt i deres krop. Så hvis jeg siger til dem, det du fortæller mig er jo, at det gør ondt, når du har brugt din arm rigtig meget, især hvis du har lavet smash. Ja, det er fuldstændig sådan, jeg har det, ikke? Men det er ikke hver gang, for det er også sådan, og det er også sådan. Og det skal vi så på en eller anden måde have kogt ned til en fortælling, som giver mening, og som kunne være, det lyder for mig som om, du har det her, vi kender som uspecifik skuldersmerter. Det vi gør ved det er det her. Ja. Det kan også være en helt anden fortælling, så fortællingen vil være individuel. Men det de higer efter, i hvert fald hvis det er det rigtige, vi læser ud af de kroniske smerte-cases, så er det følelsen af at blive anerkendt og forstået og hørt. Og det kunne være et rigtig godt sted at starte, når vi nu når dertil, hvor vi jo dybest set må sige til hinanden, jeg forstår det ikke. Så i stedet for at tro, at vi er eksperterne, fordi det er vi jo kun på den del af det, vi forstår, som kunne være biomekanikken. Men når den ikke fortæller det hele billede, så er der jo masser af mennesket stadigvæk, vi ikke har afdækket. Og det kunne vi jo måske invitere atleten lidt mere med ind i beslutningsprocessen omkring og sige, kan du ikke fortælle mig noget mere omkring det her? Og hvis ikke du fejler noget, der skal repareres, hvad kan vi så hjælpe dig med, ikke?
Jeg forestiller mig, at der kan gemme sig nogle barrierer i forhold til personlighedstyper på de folk, det vedrører. Altså folk, der er sådan lidt højreorienteret, konservative, et eller andet. De kunne godt have det stramt med det der. Altså, er det en regel, altså at denne måde at forstå det på, den resonerer ikke lige godt med forskellige typer af patienter eller klienter?
Jeg synes, det er meget sjovt. Nu, så, ligesom vi så snakker, så går Søren forbi, som har været med til at udbrede glad træning i Danmark, ikke? Som jo er et meget godt eksempel på, at ja, der er modstand mod ting, ikke? Altså træning til folk med osteoartrose, ikke? Altså den der med, jeg er jo slidt, så derfor skal jeg ikke træne, ikke? Til at sige, du har slidgigt, det kalder vi det, fordi du skal slide dig ud af det, ikke? Og så ved vi også godt, at træerne vokser ikke ind i himlen, og det er jo ikke, men for nogle mennesker er det en løsning, og for andre er kirurgi en løsning. Og mit argument er, at der er nok også flere løsninger end de to.
Ja.
Så du har ret, der er jo altid modvilje mod forandring. Og det er jo også svært, især i en setting som her, hvor mange folk er virkelig, virkelig kompetente til det går og laver. Så det er vigtigt for mig at pointere, at jeg kommer ikke og siger, at de gør noget forkert. Det eneste, jeg synes, det er, at der er noget viden, som vi måske kunne anvende, når vi går i stå. Og det er den, jeg gerne vil prøve at pege på.
Ja. Og jeg tror, for at være lidt mere specifik, altså det er patientens personlighedstype, jeg kunne forestille mig, der skaber en barriere. Det ved jeg ikke, noget du har oplevet. Altså,
Nej,
der kommer så nogen, der...
Jeg misforstod dig der.
Ja, men du troede, det var behandleren?
Ja, det er nok...
Det var mig, der var det patienten. Jeg kan godt forestille mig, at der kommer så nogle af dem der sådan er meget go-getter, og hver mand er en ø, og man skal bare... Ikke? Ja. Som gerne vil have sådan noget konkret, de vil gerne have et bestemt...
Men det synes jeg også godt, vi kan give. Altså, okay, nu er jeg biased, ikke? Fordi de patienter, jeg ser, hvis det er atleter for eksempel, så har de været igennem meget det der. Så jeg er sikker på, hvis du sidder som den første, de møder på et sygehus, eller på en klinik, eller et eller andet, eller ude i Team Danmark, jamen, så stiller de måske nogle andre forventninger. Men når jeg ser dem, så har de jo typisk været igennem noget, og de er blevet konfronteret med, at der er ikke en god forklaring, og der er ikke lige nogen, der ved, hvad det er og sådan noget. Så jeg oplever dem måske mere forandringsparate, end det, du beskriver der.
Det er fordi, jeg har en fornemmelse af, ligesom, at det er en del, den der måde at forstå smerter på, at det er en del af sådan noget diskursivt, noget større, og det minder om nogle ting, der sker i psykoterapi, og det er sådan... Og det resonerer på forskellige måder med forskellige, altså for personlighedstyper og politiske altså sådan syn og sådan noget, ikke? Det er bare, det er jo ikke sikkert, at der ligesom er lavet noget på det. Altså, jeg kan godt forestille mig, at der var nogen, at der gemmer sig nogle...
Altså nu har jeg jo erklæret min bias før, ikke? Så kan jeg jo sige det, jeg håber, jeg tror, jeg ved. Det er, at hvis vi sætter os ned og interesserer os for dem, uden at gå til dem som om, at vi ved mere, og at det er os, der har svarene. Men vær helt ærlig og sige, jeg har svarene på alt, hvad der drejer sig om de ting, jeg ved noget om, men du har alle svarene på, hvordan det påvirker dig, og hvad du selv tror, og hvad du forventer, og alt sådan noget. Og vi er sådan set eksperter på hver sin del. Så jo mere vi samarbejder, jo mere jeg forstår, hvad du siger, jo bedre kan jeg gøre det. Jeg har sådan en... Så min metafor, når jeg underviser på de her kurser, jeg tjener penge på, det er...
Millioner.
Ja.
Millioner.
det er den her idé om, at jeg sidder... Så i anamnesen, så sidder patienten og fortæller mig nogle ting, eller atleten sidder og fortæller mig nogle ting. Og så sidder jeg sådan mentalt og laver et portræt af dem. Og så forestiller jeg, at jeg har fået hele historien, og så vender jeg det der portræt om, og så siger jeg, er det sådan her, du ser dig selv? Og så er drømmescenario, at det er sådan en Rembrandt, ikke? Hvor de siger, hold da op. Sådan er der aldrig nogen, der har kunne tegne mig før. Men jeg kunne også vende den rundt og så sige, at det kunne være en Picasso. Og så siger folk, det er overhovedet ikke mig, men jeg kan godt se, at det er et flot stykke arbejde.
Ja.
Og når de så forhåbentlig siger, at det er lige mig, så siger jeg til dem, grunden til, det er vigtigt, at du kan genkende dig selv på det billede, det er fordi dybest set, så selvom jeg gerne vil sige, at det er dig, jeg tilrettelægger det ud fra, og det er individuelt og sådan noget, så er det jo min version af dig, jeg ender med at behandle. Så jo bedre jeg forstår dig, jo nemmere har jeg ved at tilrettelægge en behandling, der passer til dig. Ikke? Det vil sige, at hvis jeg siger noget, der ikke passer, hvis du synes, du hører mig sige, du har lavet for meget, og du siger, men det har jeg ikke. Jeg har faktisk ikke lavet for meget. Så er det vigtigt, at du siger det, fordi så tager jeg fejl. Og hvis ikke du siger det, så ender jeg måske med at give dig en øvelse eller en anbefaling, som du dybest set ender med ikke at tro på.
Ja.
Og det kunne så igen afsmitte sig selv i en mindre effekt.
Ja.
Så det der med at virkelig tage dem alvorligt, så det er jo det, jeg håber, der kunne være en vej frem for alle. Og så anerkender jeg, at det er nok nemmere, hvis patienten har været igennem en proces, hvor de har været i de konventionelle rammer og hørt historien mange gange med forskellige vinkler.
Ja. Nu er vi jo på Sportskongres, og meget af det her, det handler selvfølgelig om atleter og sportsskader og sådan noget. Altså alt det her med den biopsykosociale smertemodel og neuroscience, finder det anvendelse på en anden måde i atleter end i her fra Danmark? Atleter har de, altså, jeg er med på ligesom, at man kan smerte uden man kan måle noget i væven, og der kan være noget i væven uden man kan måle smerter, og så er der ligesom alle de der ting midt imellem, ikke? Men er atleter, er der en bedre overensstemmelse, eller sådan, eller hvordan finder det anvendelse
altså,
atleter?
Atleter er jo generelt set hårdere ramt, i den forstand, at små marginaler gør en stor forskel. Og der vil være nogen for hvem det at vide, at det ikke er farligt, gør, at de kan pushe igennem det. Ja. Men der er helt sikkert også atleter derude, der siger, jamen jeg kan ikke bruge det til noget, at du siger, at jeg godt må have ondt, for jeg kan ikke lave det, jeg gerne vil med ondt.
Nej.
Så smerte er jo en barriere, og det er svært helt nøjagtigt at gennemskue, ikke mindst fordi der er meget stor divergens i, hvordan man definerer en sports injury. Og der vil være nogle af dem, der har ondt og sådan noget, ikke? Ja. Hvor ondt er det primære problem. Men den måde, jeg vælger at læse litteraturen på i hvert fald, er, at der er rigtig mange, der ender med at stoppe i idrætten. Det er der ingen tvivl om. Og at meget af det der fortælling, hvis vi kigger på epidemiologien, det er, at dem, der stopper for eksempel efter en ACL-operation, der er smerten en del af billedet, altså en signifikant del af billedet. Og der vil jeg da gerne tro, at hvis vi var bedre til at forstå smerten som noget andet end resultat af en vævsskade, så vil vi også have flere tangenter at spille på, så en gruppe af de der mennesker kunne have blevet i sporten. Men når fortællingen om smerten er, du skal passe på, at det ikke gør mere ondt, fordi så kommer du mere til skade, så bliver det også virkelig svært for atleten at være tryg ved at have ondt.
Ja. Men kan man sige generelt, at atleter måske har en... Altså, de måske har en mere præcis eller en mere retvisende højere ordens processering af perifere signaler, for eksempel fordi de ligesom er mere kropsbevidste?
Ja, altså, lige nok, det er jo vældig svært at måle. Men vi har målt, om de responderer anderledes på de her smertemoduleringstest. Ja. Og det gør de ikke.
Okay.
Ja, nu er frokosten gået i gang, så hvis I kan høre, der larmer, så er det folk, der trækker stol ud og skal have noget lækker frokost. Men så lige på det punkt vil det være rigtig fedt, hvis vi har fundet ud af, at atleter er anderledes. De kan holde til mere smerte, for eksempel. Og det er faktisk ikke det, vi finder. Vi finder, at atleter ligner alle andre mennesker. De er jo ligesom alle andre mennesker, ikke? Men det, der nok kendetegner atleterne, det er jo, at de måske er bedre til at strukturere nogle ting og sådan noget. Så det kan godt være, at det potentiale, en atlet har de måske nemmere ved at udleve. Det ved vi ikke. Det er jo det, performance kunne vise.
Ja. Altså, men fraset de her tilfælde, hvor man ser tydelig vævspåvirkning uden smerte, eller smerte uden nogen tydelig. Ja. Altså, er der, man kunne godt forestille sig, at der måske gennemsnitligt set er bedre korrespondance mellem dem i atleter end i her fra Danmark. Men det ved jeg ikke, om er tilfældet.
Altså, jeg har ikke kunne finde nogen meta-analyser på det endnu, så jeg har kigget lidt i nogle forskellige systematiske reviews. Ja. Der er der nogen, der peger på, at atleterne har mere ondt end gennemsnittet, når vi taler rygsmerter i hvert fald, og der er nogen, der peger på, at de har mindre ondt.
Perfekt.
Og igen, og der er selvfølgelig forskel på, hvordan man gør det op. Men uden forhåbentlig uden at genere nogen, så tror jeg, at jeg vil sige, at vi er først og fremmest mennesker. Og med det mener jeg, at den krop, vi er udstyret med, som især nogle atleter er i stand til at udnytte til et potentiale, som jeg ikke forstår, den er også underlagt nogle restriktioner, og det lader til i hvert fald med den her sådan smertemoduleringsvinkel på, at der skal virkelig meget til at åbne op for det der ekstra potentiale. Altså den der historie med soldaten, der bliver skudt og ikke kan mærke det, og kvinden, der bliver bidt af en haj og kan kæmpe sig fri og ikke synes, det går ondt og sådan noget, ikke? Ja. Det potentiale kræver nok mere, end atleterne kan åbne op for i en konkurrence. Så vi har et potentiale, vi ikke udnytter i den smertemodulerende del af vores nervesystem, men det er sikkert ikke nok at være atlet. Så de er lige så meget mennesker som os andre, de kan være trænet i det, de kan have en simpel tilgang til det, altså at de ikke er så bange for smerte, det mener man en simpel tilgang. Ja. Fordi det har de prøvet mange gange før, og de kan sikkert holde til at have ondt og vågne op med smerter er sikkert en hverdag for dem. Så den del af det, tror jeg, er nemmere.
Okay.
Men jeg tror også, at det, de har atleterne, som mange andre mennesker mangler, det er fortællingen om, jeg gjorde det, derfor har jeg det sådan. Jeg tror også, de har nemmere ved at gå i banken og sælge ideen. Jeg trænede i går, derfor har jeg ondt. Hvor hvis du vågner op med fibromyalgi eller ondt i ryggen, og du er lagermedarbejder, så så kan det godt være sværere at gå ud og sige til arbejdsgiveren, jeg har ondt i ryggen i dag. Ja. Så jeg tror nogle gange, at atleterne har nemmere ved at sælge deres smertehistorie. Ikke? Fordi
der er nogle sociale, kulturelle forhold.
Det tror jeg faktisk ikke. Og igen er der så også studier, der viser, at når de så skal sælge det indad til, så er de bange for at blive sat af holdet, og det er et udstråling af svaghed og sådan noget. Men når nogen her på kongressen kommer og siger, jeg er simpelthen så øm i min lår, fordi jeg var ude at træne squat i går, jeg satte personlig rekord i dødløft, så får de jo bonuspoint. Ja. Og den ømhed, den bliver jo i tale sat som noget stoisk og noget flot og noget, du godt kan. Og den smerte, de har der, vil de jo bære med sig som en positiv del af deres oplevelse. Ja. Og så længe de kan kontrollere den, og de ved, at den går væk, så er de jo glade og tilfredse. Ja. Og det tror jeg faktisk, at det, der mangler mange gange, når vi så har med de her mennesker at gøre, hvor de i gåsøjne bare har ondt, altså ondt, punktum, ikke ondt fordi. Og der kunne det godt være, at noget af det, der så kunne gøre forskellen, det var, at vi snakkede med dem om, jamen du er jo vant til at have ondt, og det går væk igen. Er det lidt det, du fortæller mig? Jeg ved godt, nu føler du ikke, du kan kontrollere det, men er det lidt det? Og hvad vil der ske, hvis du arbejder med det? Så længe jeg kan stå inden for, at det ikke er farligt, er det så farligt for dig at have de her smerter? Og så kunne vi åbne op for den dialog og skabe en relation. Så der kunne det være nemmere at være atlet, ikke? Fordi de har en reference til at have ondt, og det går væk igen. Ja.
Jeg tror virkelig, det var det. Jeg har ikke flere spørgsmål.
Vi kunne nok blive ved, men tak for nu.
Jamen og hvor kan man følge med?
Det er rigtigt. I kan følge så Smertevejleder podcast, som er egentlig rettet mod patienter, der har kroniske smerter. Den er til at finde alle de steder, hvor man henter sin podcast. Også den her. Og derudover så er jeg på Twitter. Jeg hedder @mh_dk. Og så kan man finde mig på Facebook under Viden om smerter.
Fantastisk. Mange tak for din tid.
Tak fordi jeg måtte.
Det var alt for denne gang fra årets Sportskongres. Fitness MK vil gerne sige tak til Dansk Selskab for Sportsfyioterapi og Dansk Idrætsmedicinsk Selskab for at invitere os med, så vi kan få lov til at snakke med nogle af alle de fantastiske forskere og videnskabsfolk, der har præsenteret deres materiale her på kongressen. Vi håber meget at få lov til at være med igen til næste år. Kan I have det godt derude. Hej!